December 16th, 1944. Snow lies across the forests of the Ardennes, a rugged stretch of hills and narrow roads running through eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. In the early hours before dawn, German artillery opens fire along a front nearly 80 miles wide. Hundreds of guns launch shells weighing over 20 pounds toward American positions scattered across villages and forest ridges. Within minutes, telephone lines fracture, command posts lose contact with forward units, and a major German offensive begins moving west. At the center of that offensive stands a powerful formation assembled under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, the 6th SS Panzer Army. The German High Command has assigned this army a precise objective. Its armored spearheads must break through American defenses, drive across the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and ultimately push toward the port city of Antwerp, nearly 100 miles away. If successful, the maneuver could split Allied armies in Western Europe and stall the advance toward Germany. Achieving that objective requires enormous resources. Dietrich's army fields several elite armored divisions equipped with tanks weighing between 25 tons and nearly 70 tons, each machine carrying cannons capable of firing shells weighing more than 20 pounds. Fuel becomes the first critical variable. German planners calculate that the offensive requires thousands of tons of gasoline simply to begin moving the armored columns. A single heavy tank, such as the Tiger II, weighing roughly 69 tons, burns fuel rapidly during winter operations. Supply trucks carrying drums weighing over 40 pounds each assemble behind the front lines, attempting to support the advance with reserves measured in hundreds of tons. Inside one of those tanks, waiting in the darkness before the attack, the crew sits cramped beneath thick armor plates. The engine vibrates through the steel hull as mechanics complete final checks. The gunner's cannon points forward, loaded with a shell weighing around 22 pounds. Outside the vehicle, infantry units gather beside armored columns stretching down frozen forest roads. At dawn, the assault begins. German armored units surge forward through the Ardennes under heavy fog that stalls Allied aircraft. Columns of tanks and armored vehicles grind across narrow roads bordered by snow-covered trees. Engineers attempt to clear obstacles while artillery batteries fire continuous barrages ahead of the advancing troops. Dietrich's army includes several Waffen-SS formations, among them the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart, 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and other units equipped with hundreds of armored vehicles. Each division requires ammunition measured in tons and fuel measured in thousands of gallons, simply to maintain forward movement. Yet the terrain begins resisting the advance almost immediately. The Ardennes road network cannot support multiple armored columns moving simultaneously. A single destroyed vehicle can stall dozens of tanks behind it. Traffic jams stretch for miles along forest routes, while engineers struggle to clear wreckage and damaged bridges. Inside a stalled armored column, the crew hears the low rumble of engines idling around them. The driver wipes condensation from a viewing slit, while the loader adjusts shells stacked along the turret wall. Each projectile weighs more than 20 pounds, ready to fire at any American unit blocking the road ahead. American resistance stiffens quickly. Small groups of soldiers defend road junctions and villages with anti-tank guns capable of firing armor-piercing rounds weighing several pounds each. Artillery batteries respond with shells exploding across forest clearings. In some sectors, German units advance several miles. In others, they stall completely. When I studied operational reports from the Ardennes campaign years ago, I noticed how frequently the same phrase appears in German documents: fuel shortage. Tanks capable of crushing enemy positions still require gasoline. Without it, a 70-ton vehicle becomes an immobile block of steel sitting in the middle of a winter road. One dramatic episode occurs near the village of Bonnier, where a detachment from the 1st SS Panzer Division captures American prisoners of war. The incident becomes known as the Malmedy Massacre, where 84 American prisoners are killed after being assembled in a field. The event later becomes one of the most controversial and investigated war crimes connected with the offensive. Meanwhile, Allied forces begin regrouping. American divisions rush reinforcements toward the Ardennes, while artillery units reposition guns firing shells heavier than 20 pounds toward advancing German columns. Weather conditions improve slightly, allowing Allied aircraft carrying bombs weighing hundreds of pounds to begin striking German supply routes. Inside the turret of a tank attempting to push west, the crew hears the distant roar of aircraft engines overhead. The commander scans the sky while the engine continues vibrating beneath the hull. The offensive begins eroding within days. German armored formations consume fuel faster than supply trucks can replace it. Road congestion stalls movement. Allied resistance grows stronger as reinforcements arrive. The ambitious drive toward Antwerp gradually fractures into smaller defensive battles across villages and frozen fields. I sometimes find myself studying maps of the Ardennes offensive and tracing the narrow forest roads where entire armored divisions attempted to move simultaneously. The lines look thin on paper. On the ground, they carried tanks weighing dozens of tons, trucks hauling fuel by the barrel, and thousands of soldiers marching through winter snow. And if you are listening now, while the quiet rhythm of the night begins settling in, imagine the Ardennes forest long after the engines stop. Snow falls silently across roads once crowded with armored columns. The machines that roared through those woods now rest as rusted fragments scattered across the hills. In the story ahead, we will examine how the 6th SS Panzer Army assembled for the Ardennes offensive, how Sepp Dietrich's armored divisions pushed into Belgium, how logistical failures stalled their advance, and how the battle ultimately fractured Germany's final major offensive in the West. This is the entire history of the 6th SS Panzer Army at the Battle of the Bulge, the command led by Sepp Dietrich during the winter of 1944. Chapter 1. The Butcher's Commission. The 28th of May 1942, a training field in Bavaria, unremarkable in every way. A stocky, broad-shouldered man stands watching a column of trucks grind past in the morning fog, his hands clasped behind his back, his cap sitting low over a face that looks like it was cut from something harder than skin. He doesn't say anything. He just watches. His name is Sepp Dietrich. The men under his command call him Sepp. Most of the German general staff call him something else, but not to his face. Not yet. What makes Dietrich interesting to me, genuinely, specifically interesting, as a researcher rather than as a narrator, isn't the rank he eventually held. It's the distance between where he started and where he ended up, and the specific mechanism by which that distance was crossed. He was born on the 28th of May, 1892, in the village of Howangen in Bavaria. His father was a tradesman. Sepp Dietrich entered the German army as a teenager in 1911, and he rose, through 4 years of war and genuine courage, to the rank of sergeant. When the war ended, he was a decorated, non-commissioned officer with real combat experience, good instincts under fire, and absolutely no formal military education above the regimental level. For most men, that would have been the ceiling. The First World War gave Germany a specific kind of veteran, men who'd seen the real machinery of modern combat, who understood men under stress, who'd built their authority not through academy certificates, but through the much simpler currency of not breaking when things went badly. Dietrich was one of those men. He served in one of Germany's earliest tank units, the Sturmpanzerwagen formations, which gave him a feel for armored warfare at its most primitive and brutal. In the years after 1918, he drifted through the economic wreckage of Weimar Germany, doing the things that former sergeants do when there's no army left to sergeant in. He worked in various capacities, none of them distinguished. He joined the Bund Oberland, one of the post-war paramilitary formations that flourished in the chaos. And somewhere in the early 1920s, he encountered Adolf Hitler. That encounter, that specific personal connection, is the hinge on which everything else in this story turns. On the 8th and 9th of November 1923, Dietrich was present for the beer hall putsch in Munich, the failed attempt by Hitler and his followers to seize power through street violence. He marched with the column. He was arrested. He was tried. And from that moment, he belonged to a very short list of men whom Hitler would never fully abandon, no matter what the professional military thought of them. By 1932, he was commanding Hitler's personal bodyguard. By 1940, he commanded the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the division grown from that bodyguard, in the campaign in France. By 1944, he'd led a corps at Caen in the brutal defensive fighting against British and Canadian armored offensives in Normandy, where his performance was, by most professional accounts, genuinely solid at the tactical level. Then, in October of 1944, Hitler gave him an army. The 6th SS Panzer Army, 4 elite SS Panzer divisions, 3 SS infantry divisions, independent heavy tank battalions equipped with the most formidable armored vehicles Germany had ever built. On paper, it was the most powerful German formation assembled on the Western Front since Kursk. And it was handed to a man whose formal military education consisted of a 6-week course at the SS Junkerschule Braunschweig in 1934, 11 years before he was expected to use what he learned there. The German General Staff's reaction was not surprise. It was something quieter and more corrosive than surprise. It was resignation. When I was working through the post-war interrogation files from the American military's Foreign Military Studies program, specifically the manuscript logged as A-924, Fritz Kramer's 60-page account of the 6th Panzer Army's operations, I kept coming back to a specific quality in Kramer's prose. He was Dietrich's chief of staff, the professional Generalmajor, who actually translated Dietrich's intentions into operational orders, and his account is scrupulously correct. It doesn't attack Dietrich, it doesn't mock him, but it describes the planning process in a way that makes the division of labor absolutely clear. Kramer did the architecture. Dietrich occupied the building. The question that haunts the entire Ardennes campaign, that I haven't fully resolved to my own satisfaction, is whether a more professionally educated army commander would have done anything materially different in December 1944, given the plan he was handed. Maybe not. But the nature of Dietrich's authority meant there was nobody in the command structure with both the standing and the inclination to push back on Hitler's assumptions. And those assumptions were, from the beginning, deeply flawed. To me, the most revealing detail from this period isn't a battle map or an order of battle. It's a sentence from the U.S. Army's official history of the Ardennes campaign. Hugh Cole's meticulous 1965 study, describing Dietrich as a man despised by most of the higher officer class, who had no great intelligence, but a genuine reputation for bravery. Cole wrote that from the accumulated weight of hundreds of interrogation reports, staff diaries, and after-action assessments, he wasn't editorializing, he was synthesizing. And the portrait that emerges from that synthesis is of a man who was genuinely effective in the role of a fighting divisional or corps commander, physically brave, tenacious, good with soldiers, and genuinely out of his depth the moment the job required the kind of systematic operational thinking that Army-level command demands. The 4 SS Panzer divisions assigned to his army in the autumn of 1944 had approximately 500 tanks and assault guns between them, including roughly 90 Tiger I and Tiger II heavy tanks, representing somewhere close to 36% of all operational German heavy tank strength on the entire Western Front at that moment. The strategic reserve of a collapsing empire, concentrated in one place under one command. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 9th SS Panzer Division, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Each of them had been pulled out of combat, rested, and rebuilt over the preceding weeks for this specific operation. The men who crewed those tanks were, in many cases, veterans of 3 or 4 years of the most intensive armored combat in history. The Army's weakness wasn't its teeth. It was everything behind the teeth. The engineers, the logisticians, the bridging companies, the fuel trains, the maintenance battalions. The German after-action assessments from this period repeatedly note that the SS formations were under-equipped with engineer units relative to what their operational assignments demanded. The 6th SS Panzer Army's logistics tail, when the formation returns are examined carefully, was built for a short, violent, successful operation. It wasn't built for the alternative. And on the 15th of December, 1944, one day before the offensive began, nobody in Dietrich's headquarters, and certainly not Dietrich himself, was planning seriously for the alternative. The 15th of December. The assembly areas in the Eifel Hills are quiet. The camouflage netting is up. The radio silence is absolute. The soldiers have been told only what they need to know, that there will be an attack, that it will be decisive, that the Führer himself has ordered it and believes in it completely. In a farmhouse near Münster Eifel, Sepp Dietrich is, by the accounts of those present, in good spirits. The story that a logistics officer raised the fuel shortage question that evening and was dismissed, it's third hand, it's unverifiable, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the sentiment it captures is consistent with enough independent accounts of Dietrich's command culture that I find it credible in spirit, if not in specific detail. The man who had marched in the putsch, who had built his authority on forward motion and personal courage, was not temperamentally built for logistical pessimism. Tomorrow, the guns would speak. Tomorrow, everything would be answered. Chapter 2. The Plan That Didn't Fit the Map. On the 16th of September, 1944, Hitler sat down with his senior military advisors and announced, in the words recorded by those present, "I shall go over to the attack, out of the Ardennes, toward Antwerp." There was a silence in the room. Not the silence of men absorbing a brilliant idea, the quieter, more careful silence of men calculating how to survive disagreeing with it. The planning for what would become Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, began in earnest through October of 1944. Hitler's concept was architecturally simple and operationally enormous. Two panzer armies would burst through the thinly held Ardennes sector of the Allied line, cross the Meuse River, drive northwest, and seize the port of Antwerp. Antwerp was the vital supply artery for all of Eisenhower's forces in the north. Cutting it off, Hitler believed, would split the Allied armies, trigger a political crisis between the British and Americans, and force a negotiated settlement on the Western Front, buying Germany time, or perhaps something more, against the Soviet pressure in the East. It was a tremendous plan in every sense of the word, tremendous in ambition, tremendous in the weight of resources it required, and tremendous, I keep returning to this word, in the weight of assumptions it demanded that everyone in the planning chain simply accept and not examine. The specific assignment of the main effort to Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, rather than Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, which was given the adjacent sector to the south, deserves careful attention, because it was not a purely military decision. Early planning drafts from September 1944 placed the weight of the offensive further south, where the terrain was marginally more open and the road network somewhat more capable. Hitler personally redirected the emphasis northward. He wanted his SS formations, the ones built from his bodyguard, the ones whose commanders had marched with him, to have the honor of the breakthrough. The 6th SS Panzer Army sector, running from Monschau south to the Losheim Gap, was narrower than it would have been under a purely terrain-driven plan. The roads available to the armored columns were worse. The ground between the start line and the Meuse was more demanding. These facts were known, they were discussed, and they were subordinated to political preference. The Losheim Gap, the historic invasion corridor running roughly 8 kilometers wide at the Belgian-German border, was the critical entry point for Dietrich's main armored thrust. Through this gap, and through the road network beyond it, the 1st SS Panzer Corps' 2 armored divisions were expected to pour westward after the infantry had torn the hole in the American line. The 2 primary armored routes, designated Route C and Route D in German planning documents, running through Bühlingen-Malmedy and through Honsfeld respectively, were secondary roads. Most of them were single-lane in stretches. Several crossed bridges whose weight capacity, per German engineering surveys conducted in the planning period, was well below the 68 tons of the Tiger II Königstiger, the King Tiger tank that was supposed to provide the armored fist of the breakthrough. The primary bridge on the Aare River, on the King Tiger's assigned approach route, had a rated capacity of 40 tons. The King Tiger weighed 68.65 tons. This fact was in the engineering files. It was in the planning documents. There was no solution for it in the initial plan. When I was cross-referencing the march orders with the road capacity assessments in the planning records, specifically Fritz Kramer's post-war account, manuscript A-924 in the Foreign Military Studies series, I found something that I think is the single most important sentence in the entire pre-battle record. Kramer states, in the careful language of a man writing with full awareness that his account might be read by prosecutors, that when the Army staff analyzed the road network, it was immediately apparent that the movement timetables required were optimistic. He doesn't say impossible, he says optimistic. In the diplomatic vocabulary of German military staff officers, those words are almost synonymous. The Army's planned rate of advance assumed that American resistance on the first day would be minimal, that the infantry breakthrough would succeed completely and quickly, that the armored columns would be rolling west by the evening of December the 16th, and that the Meuse would be reached within 3 days. There was no operational contingency written into the plan for what would happen if American resistance did not collapse on schedule. None. The fuel situation, separately, was its own category of structural problem. A German armored division required a certain number of Verbrauchssätze, consumption units, to conduct sustained operations. One consumption unit represented enough fuel for a division to travel approximately 100 kilometers under average conditions. To reach the Meuse from the start line, roughly 90 kilometers, under winter combat conditions, the 4 armored divisions of the 6th SS Panzer Army would have needed something approaching 6 consumption units each, accounting for the dramatically elevated consumption of heavy tanks on frozen, unpaved roads. The Army's actual fuel reserve on the 15th of December, per the Quartermaster Section's records, was closer to 1.5 consumption units available for forward units. The remainder was designated as in transit. It hadn't arrived. The plan, when the fuel figures are examined without the surrounding optimism about American collapse, assumed that the shortfall would be made good by capturing American supply dumps. This assumption was not labeled as an assumption in any planning document I've been able to examine. It was presented as a given. There's a specific moment in the pre-battle period that I think deserves more attention than it typically receives. In the planning maps captured after the war, specifically the situation maps held in American records, there is a notation on the road routing through the Losheim Gap, written in a different hand than the rest of the annotations. The German word fraglich, questionable. Somebody wrote that down. Somebody, looking at the road, looking at the bridges, looking at the timetable, found something that didn't add up and reached for a pencil. We don't know whose hand it is. We don't know if it was shown to Dietrich or to Model at Army Group B or to anyone else in the chain of command. The offensive proceeded without anyone answering the question the word asked. The assembly itself, moving all of this into position, was its own considerable achievement. In the 3 nights before the 16th of December, the 1st SS Panzer Corps moved approximately 21,000 men and 240 armored vehicles into a 15-kilometer-wide assembly zone under absolute radio silence and strict blackout conditions. The traffic control reports from this period, covering the narrow Eifel roads, document gridlock. Units were still arriving at their designated positions when the artillery opened up. Some tank battalions hadn't cleared the approach roads. The margin for error that the plan required, everything working, everything on time, everything in its place, had already been spent in the assembly before a single shot was fired. The offensive's timetable was already slipping at 0 hour. It just didn't know it yet. On the evening of the 15th of December, the temperature in the Eifel Hills dropped to roughly -10 degrees Celsius. The Maybach HL-230 engine powering the Panther and Tiger II required, in those conditions, between 30 and 45 minutes of engine warming before the hydraulic transmission systems were operational, a technical requirement that would prove, in the days ahead, to have consequences that no amount of aggressive forward momentum could undo. The ground was frozen hard. The forests were silent. The guns were registered and ready. Somewhere behind the German lines, a quartermaster officer was staring at fuel returns that didn't add up and couldn't make them add up, and had reported as much up the chain, and had been told, in so many words, that this was the Führer's plan, and the Führer was confident. The 15th of December, 1944. Everything was ready. The question that nobody had fully answered was, ready for what? Chapter 3. 0 Hour. The Guns of December 16th. 5:30 hours. The 16th of December, 1944. In the forest positions of the United States Army's 99th Infantry Division, stretched across roughly 19 miles of the Belgian-German border, the darkness was just beginning to soften at the edges. Not enough to see by, barely enough to feel. L Company of the 394th Infantry Regiment was near the Buchholz Railroad Station, a cluster of buildings alongside an abandoned line, and the morning routine was grinding forward the way morning routines do, in static positions. Men moving toward the field kitchen, breath clouding in the frozen air, the particular quiet of a sector that had been quiet for weeks. Some of them were lining up for breakfast. Then the earth moved. The German artillery barrage that opened at 05:30 covered the entire 6th SS Panzer Army front, from Monschau in the north down to the Losheim Gap in the south, a front of roughly 25 kilometers, with the concentrated fire of 2 artillery corps and 2 Volkswerfer rocket artillery brigades. Signal wire connecting American frontline units to their artillery went down in the first 5 minutes. Radio communication degraded. The men in the forward positions were, in those first moments, fighting alone before they even knew there was a fight. The American regimental executive officer's after-action note that his battalion initially identified the opening barrage as outgoing mail, fire from friendly guns, is the kind of detail that historians often quote for its dark comedy. I think it's more important than that. It tells us something about the quality of the deception and about how thoroughly the German concentration had been concealed. Nobody was expecting this. Not here. Not now. The barrage lasted approximately 1 hour and 5 minutes across most sectors. The American frontline troops had spent weeks improving their positions with log roofing over their foxholes. Not dramatic engineering, just the practical work of men who had time and timber, and this preparation held. Casualties during the bombardment itself were relatively light. What mattered was the communications disruption, the shock, and the fog. Literal ground fog that had settled into the forest and wouldn't lift, reducing visibility to a matter of yards in the trees. When the German infantry moved forward at approximately 0700 hours, they were moving through conditions that made coordination difficult for both sides, but that favored the attacker in one specific way. The American commanders couldn't see what was coming at them, couldn't assess its scale, and couldn't get clear information up the chain of command about what was happening across the full breadth of their sector. At the Buchholz Railroad Station, L Company's morning dissolved into something that looked, in the first confused minutes, almost manageable. German infantry, elements of the 27th Fusilier Regiment of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, approached along the railroad track in a column of twos through the fog. They were initially misidentified as friendly troops. This misidentification lasted, by the regimental after-action account, approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Then the rifles opened up, and the morning became something else entirely. The subsequent fight at the station was close and sustained, a 3-inch tank destroyer working systematically over the boxcars along the track, mortar crews raking the open ground beside the right-of-way, and at least one identified instance of individual American soldiers preventing German troops from gaining the roundhouse at close quarters. By noon, approximately 75 German dead lay in front of the station. L Company had taken 25 to 30 casualties of its own. And Route D, one of the 2 primary armored approach roads designated for the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was still closed. Further south, at the Losheimer Graben crossroads, the fighting was heavier and the margins narrower. This particular crossroads, where a main paved road connecting Boulingen and Malmedy crossed the North-South International Highway, was Route C's gateway to the west. It was the road that Kampfgruppe Peiper's armored column needed to reach and pass through if it was going to make its scheduled westward dash. The 1st Battalion of the 394th Infantry was defending it. The 48th Grenadier Regiment of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, working through thick forest and minefield and barbed wire, struck between two of the battalion's companies after noon. B Company lost roughly 60 men and was pushed back approximately 400 yards before stiffening. Sergeant Eddie Dolink moved his machine gun forward to a shell crater for better fields of fire. He was last seen still firing, with German dead mounded in front of his position. C Company lost its outposts, but held its main line throughout the day. The crossroads remained in American hands at nightfall. The armored columns were still waiting. To me, the most operationally significant fact about the 16th of December isn't the scale of the German assault or the shock of the surprise. It's this. The planned German timetable called for the infantry to achieve a breakthrough on the first day, creating corridors through which the panzer divisions would then pour. By last light on December the 16th, no such corridor existed anywhere in the 6th SS Panzer Army's sector. The 3 infantry divisions of the 1st SS Panzer Corps had penetrated American lines in several places, but they hadn't broken through. The 2 armored divisions, the 1st SS Panzer and the 12th SS Panzer, had not moved from their assembly areas. They were ready. The road wasn't ready for them. The timetable that Hitler had declared inviolable had been violated by L Company at a railroad station, and by B Company at a crossroads, and by the simple refusal of American soldiers, most of them in their first combat, to do what the plan required them to do. In the north of the 6th SS Panzer Army's zone, at Hofen and Monschau, the situation was even starker. The 67th Corps, the corps assigned to protect Dietrich's northern flank, attacked with what amounted to 3 to 4 battalions of infantry, supported by heavy artillery, against the 3rd Battalion of the 395th Infantry at Hofen and the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron at Monschau. The assault on Hofen at approximately 0600 hours on December the 16th was, by any objective measure, catastrophic for the attackers. The German infantry advanced across open ground into American weapons at close range. 3 verified instances exist in the American after-action records of German soldiers being shot close enough that their bodies fell into American foxholes. American casualties in the Hofen defense that morning: 4 killed, 7 wounded, 4 missing. The attacking force lost an estimated 1/5 of its strength in a few hours. Field Marshal Model had forbidden the use of artillery at Monschau to preserve the German town from damage, a decision that further hamstrung the northern attack. By the end of the first day, the entire northern flank of the 6th SS Panzer Army's offensive had achieved nothing. When I read the 67th Corps' assessment of its own first-day performance, admittedly reconstructed from American after-action accounts rather than German originals, since German records for this period are fragmentary, I'm struck by how specifically the failure maps onto the terrain. The open ground around Hofen gave the defenders exactly the fields of fire they needed. The American searchlight technique that the Germans had replicated, bouncing anti-aircraft searchlights off the low cloud cover to create artificial moonlight, worked against the attackers at Hofen by outlining them against the pale sky. A tactical innovation had become a liability in conditions nobody had fully modeled. There's a lesson in there that runs through the whole Ardennes story. The plan was built on a specific set of conditions, and the conditions weren't cooperating. By nightfall on December the 16th, the 6th SS Panzer Army's command post at Münstereifel was absorbing reports that told a consistent story of partial penetration and no breakthrough. The infantry had pushed into American positions in the Losheim Gap area, had created some gaps, had overwhelmed some positions by sheer weight of numbers in the dense forest where individual American strongpoints couldn't mutually support each other. But the armored routes were not open. The panzer divisions had not moved. The timetable was already a day behind, and Sepp Dietrich, the man who had been personally selected by Hitler for this command, The man in whose army the strategic reserve of Germany's Western Front was concentrated had a decision to make about the next morning. The night of the 16th was cold and clear, and the American commanders were working fast. Major General Walter M. Robertson of the 2nd Infantry Division was already planning to withdraw his regiments from the Wallerscheid attack, pulling them back toward the twin villages of Rocherat and Krinkelt, from which they could defend the approaches to Elsenborn Ridge. The 26th Infantry of the 1st Infantry Division, held in reserve at the 7th Corps, was loaded onto trucks at midnight and pointed south. Small movements. Quiet movements. The kind of movements that don't appear dramatic in the historical record, but that, when traced forward in time, determine everything. Chapter 4. Peiper's Knife. The spearhead breaks through. Approximately 0200 hours, the 17th of December, 1944. On a secondary road winding through the forest darkness south of Losheim, a column began to move. It was enormous. 117 tanks, a mixture of Panther Mark V's, Tiger Mark 6's, and the massive 68-ton King Tiger, led a procession of 149 half-tracks, 24 artillery pieces, and more than 30 anti-aircraft weapons, carrying 4,800 men. It was the most powerful single armored formation in the entire German offensive. Its commanding officer was a 30-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer named Joachim Peiper. In the darkness and the cold, the column moved west. Peiper had been waiting. While the infantry had been battering itself against the American positions on December the 16th, his Kampfgruppe had been sitting in its assembly area, engines running at intervals to keep the machinery from freezing, consuming the fuel it didn't have to spare, waiting for the hole that the infantry had promised to punch and hadn't fully punched. What finally opened a path for him wasn't a clean breakthrough in his own assigned sector. It was the collapse of the 14th Cavalry Group in the Losheim Gap, the seam between the 99th Division's right flank and the 106th Division's left. A gap in the American line, several kilometers wide, through which the Kampfgruppe could insert itself before the Americans understood what was happening. Peiper was given the route and turned his column loose in the darkness. The battle for the North Shoulder had failed to create the breakthrough on schedule. Peiper was going to find one anyway. The first hours of the advance were remarkable by any measure. Hansfeld, where American soldiers were reportedly sleeping when the lead vehicles arrived. Bulge, where a United States Army Air Force fuel point was overrun. The column stopped, refueled from captured American stocks, and continued west. The quantity captured at Bulge has been variously estimated, but the most consistent figures suggest aviation-grade fuel, largely 100 octane, which German engines could use, but at reduced efficiency. It wasn't ideal. It was enough to keep moving. The image of German tanks refueling from American pumps on the second morning of Hitler's great counteroffensive is not an image that appears in the German propaganda newsreels of the period. It tells a more honest story about the state of the logistical plan than any official report. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon of December the 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper's column was moving west on the road between Malmedy and the village of Ligneuville when it came upon a convoy of American vehicles at the Bonnier Crossroads, a plateau above Malmedy where several roads intersected. The vehicles belonged to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans were on the road, in trucks, moving south. They had no meaningful anti-tank capability. They were captured without significant resistance. What happened next, in a snow-covered field southeast of the crossroads, over the following hour, is documented in sworn statements taken by Army Criminal Investigation Division agents in the days afterward. The column moved on. It kept moving west. The chapter of what it left behind in that field will wait. But I want to mark the time. 12:30, December the 17th. The column had been moving for approximately 10 hours. It had covered roughly 40 kilometers. It was still, for the moment, running. Peiper's instincts as a tactical commander were, by any honest assessment, exceptional. At Ligneuville, he turned south rather than continuing west on the more obvious route. A decision made by his own post-war account because the road was there. The pragmatism of it is almost disarming. He wasn't consulting a doctrine manual. He was reading terrain in motion, finding the path of least resistance, keeping the column moving. By the evening of December the 17th, he had reached the outskirts of Stavelot, a Belgian town on the Amblève River. His lead elements could see the town. The bridge was there, and somewhere in that town, though Peiper didn't know it, sat a United States Army fuel dump, estimated at approximately 2.2 million gallons of gasoline, the largest single fuel stockpile in his path, the solution to every problem that was already beginning to accumulate behind him. He stopped. The official record attributes the halt to concerns about a night ambush in an unfamiliar town, and that reasoning is tactically defensible. Night attacks in built-up areas with armored columns on narrow roads are genuinely dangerous without adequate infantry reconnaissance. But the cost of the halt is staggering when examined in retrospect. The Americans, alerted to the presence of the Kampfgruppe by survivors who had escaped or been released, began moving to defend Stavelot through the night. By the time Peiper attacked on the morning of December the 18th, the window was already narrowing. When the column finally pushed through Stavelot and a subordinate element found the dump, the process of destruction was already underway. Peiper never captured meaningful fuel from the Stavelot stockpile. He had halted, in the darkness of December the 17th, less than 3 kilometers from a solution that would have changed everything about the next week of his life. I've driven the route Peiper took. Not in December, not in a tank. In summer, in a rental car, with a road atlas that's slightly too optimistic about the quality of the minor roads. What strikes me, every time, is the relationship between the terrain and the options it presents. The Amblève Valley is beautiful and confining. The roads follow the river because the hills on either side don't give you much choice. Every bridge is a decision point. Every bridge is also a vulnerability. The 391st Engineer Battalion's demolition teams understood this in ways that Peiper, moving fast and focused west, perhaps didn't fully credit. At Trois Ponts, on the afternoon of December the 18th, American engineers, a small detachment by the accounts, fewer than a platoon's strength at the critical bridge, blew 3 separate bridges in Peiper's face as his lead vehicles came into view. Each demolition was timed to the arrival of German armor. Each destroyed bridge forced the column further north, onto progressively worse roads, burning more fuel, widening the gap between Peiper's forward elements and any possibility of resupply. The mathematics of the situation were becoming inexorable. The Kampfgruppe had begun the offensive with fuel for perhaps 200 kilometers of road movement under favorable conditions. The King Tigers were consuming fuel at rates 2 to 3 times higher than those figures assumed, on frozen roads with gradients that punished their transmissions. The 2.2 million gallons at Stavelot had been missed. The bridges at Trois Ponts had closed the western routes. By December the 19th, when Peiper's column reached its furthest westward point near Stummel, approximately 25 kilometers east of the Meuse, the situation was already irreversible, though not yet obviously so. The Americans were closing in from 3 directions. The 80th Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion and elements of the 30th Infantry Division were blocking his western advance. The roads behind him were under growing pressure. On the 23rd of December, Peiper sent a radio message to the 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters requesting fuel and permission to break out on foot if necessary. According to his own post-war account, he received a message back promising resupply within 24 hours. Dietrich, in his own post-war account, denied sending any such message. The German communications records for this date are incomplete, and I found no way to resolve this contradiction with the available evidence. What is documented, unambiguously, is what happened the following day. Peiper ordered his remaining soldiers, roughly 800 men by that point, to abandon all vehicles, all artillery, all wounded who couldn't walk, and move out on foot through the snow. They left behind 28 operational armored vehicles. They left behind a King Tiger, turret number 213, its engine compartment containing an unrepaired transmission, The maintenance log entry dated the 14th of December still technically open. They walked out through German-held forest on Christmas Eve, 1944, and reached German lines. The Kampfgruppe was over. Chapter 5. Blood in the Snow. The Bonnier Massacre. The 17th of December, 1944, 12:30 in the afternoon, a field southeast of the Bonnier crossroads between Malmedy and Ligneuville in eastern Belgium. The field was a pasture, flat and open, covered in a thin crust of snow that had frozen overnight. There were approximately 120 American soldiers in that field, most of them from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, artillerymen, surveyors, communications specialists. They had been captured on the road minutes earlier. They were standing in the field in loose groups, some still in their overcoats, some with their hands raised. German soldiers with weapons stood around the perimeter. For a brief period, how brief, the survivors can't agree, and the disagreement itself is significant. There was something that might have looked like order. Then it wasn't. What the sworn statements establish, there are dozens of them taken by Army Criminal Investigation Division agents beginning as early as December the 23rd, 1944, when the first coherent survivor accounts reached American military investigators, is a sequence of events that is consistent across independent accounts in its broad outline and inconsistent in specific details in ways that are entirely characteristic of trauma testimony. The shooting started. It involved small arms, machine guns, and at least one vehicle-mounted weapon. It lasted, by most survivor estimates, several minutes. Of the approximately 120 men in that field, 84 were killed. 43 survived by feigning death, by running, or by reaching a nearby roadside cafe that was also attacked. The column drove on. The forensic evidence collected when the field was reached by American forces in January 1945, after weeks of additional snowfall had covered and preserved the bodies, is documented in graves registration records that are among the most specific and most sobering primary sources from the entire Ardennes campaign. The pattern of wounds noted by the examining officers includes a significant proportion of entry wounds to the back and top of the skull, consistent with shots fired at close range at men already lying in the snow. This is not the wound pattern of men killed in a firefight or in the confusion of a running engagement. The wound pattern is the wound pattern of a deliberate process. It was documented by American Army medical personnel in the clinical language of official reports, without adjectives, and that clinical restraint makes it more devastating, not less. What the trial record and the historical debate have never fully resolved, and I want to be honest about this because it matters, is the question of where the order came from. The prosecution at the Malmedy trial, conducted at Dachau between May and July of 1946, presented testimony from two former Waffen-SS officers who stated that they had heard, at a pre-battle briefing, an instruction, attributed ultimately to Dietrich, that prisoners should not be an encumbrance to the advance. Dietrich denied it. Peiper denied it. The two witnesses gave accounts that were consistent in general thrust and inconsistent in precise wording. The defense argued that the testimony had been shaped by the investigation process, and there were genuine, documented irregularities in some of the pretrial interrogations that subsequent review boards acknowledged. The prosecution's case for an explicit verbal order given at a specific briefing has never been definitively established. But there's a different question, and I think it's the more important one. The Bonnier Massacre wasn't an isolated event within Kampfgruppe Peiper's December advance. At Honsfeld, approximately 19 American prisoners were killed. At Boulingen, American prisoners and Belgian civilians were killed. At Ligneuville, at least 8 American officers were killed after capture. These killings occurred across multiple locations over the course of roughly 36 hours, involving different subordinate units of the Kampfgruppe. The pattern, repeated across distance and time, is harder to explain as a spontaneous reaction to battlefield stress than the prosecution's critics suggest. What it looks like, when the incidents are mapped together, is not an explicit order given at a briefing. What it looks like is a unit that understood, through some combination of established culture and implicit permission, that prisoners were not going to be a problem because prisoners were not going to be kept. The 12th SS Panzer Division had done something similar in Normandy. In June 1944, soldiers of that division murdered Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardennes. The perpetrators were 18 and 19 years old. They hadn't been given a written order. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Peiper's parent formation, had a documented history of similar behavior on the Eastern Front, where the ideological framework of a war of racial annihilation had systematized a brutality that didn't require fresh orders for each fresh situation. By December 1944, when the Leibstandarte moved west, that institutional culture moved with it. I'm not offering this as exculpation for any individual. I'm offering it as the most honest explanation the available evidence supports. There is a survivor's account from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum's recorded testimony archive, given by a man who feigned death in the snow at Bagnères for approximately 4 hours. He lay still while German soldiers moved among the bodies. He heard footsteps close to him. He did not move. He was 22 years old. He eventually crawled away after dark and reached American lines that night, and gave the first coherent account of the massacre to Army investigators. His testimony was in the investigators' hands within days. It was transmitted to Eisenhower's headquarters. Within 48 hours, awareness of what had happened at Bagnères had spread through American units across the Ardennes front, documented in after-action reports that note the effect on combat behavior in subsequent engagements. That effect, the way the knowledge traveled, and what it changed, is part of the massacre's history too, though it's rarely included in accounts that focus on the killing itself. 73 Waffen-SS defendants were tried at the Malmedy proceedings. In July of 1946, 43 were sentenced to death. 22 received life sentences. Sepp Dietrich received 25 years. Joachim Peiper received a death sentence. By 1951, through clemency proceedings that became entangled with Cold War politics in ways that will be examined in a later chapter, all death sentences had been commuted. By 1956, every defendant had been released. The 84 men in that field had no equivalent process, no equivalent calendar, no equivalent conclusion. The bodies in the Bagnères field remained under snow from December the 17th until American forces retook the area in January 1945. When the graves registration teams arrived, they worked through the snow and the cold with the deliberate care of men who understood that what they were documenting mattered beyond the immediate moment, that the state of those bodies, the pattern of those wounds, the positions of those men in the frozen ground was evidence. They were right. Their reports were presented at Dachau. They were entered as exhibits. They helped convict 73 men. And then, slowly, through a decade of legal proceedings and political calculations and Cold War arithmetic, the weight of those exhibits was renegotiated downward until it balanced against something other than justice. The snow, when it came again the following December, covered the field again. It always does. Chapter 6. Elsenborn, where the Panzer Army broke its teeth. The 17th of December, 1944, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At the command post of the 2nd Infantry Division, Major General Walter M. Robertson received confirmation of what his forward units had been reporting all day. The German offensive was not a limited counterattack. It was an army. It was coming from the east, and it was coming toward him, and the road it needed most was the road that ran through the twin Belgian villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, the same road that 2 of his own regiments were using to withdraw from the Wallerscheid attack they'd been conducting for the previous 4 days. Robertson had perhaps 6 hours before the 12th SS Panzer Division reached those villages. His decision, recorded in the 2nd Division War Diary with the compressed directness of a man who didn't have time for subordinate clauses. Commander directs retrograde through Rocherath-Krinkelt to Elsenborn positions. Commander states, "We hold the road open or nobody gets out." 7 words. an operational decision that would shape the entire northern shoulder of the Bulge. Krinkelt and Rosherath were not impressive places. Twin hamlets, almost merged into one, sitting in the rolling farmland south of Elsenborn at an elevation of roughly 550 meters. Their importance was entirely cartographic. Roads from both the north and the east converged through them before continuing west toward the Elsenborn Plateau. Whoever held those villages controlled access to the ridge. The 2nd Infantry Division's regiments, the 9th and 38th Infantry, were coming out of the forest to the north, with the 12th SS Panzer Division pressing from the east, and Robertson needed the villages to be open long enough for his men to pass through them. And then he needed them to be held long enough to make the ridge defensible. He was essentially asking his units to fight a rearguard action through a place while simultaneously preparing to defend it. In 2 days of fighting that has few parallels in the Western European campaign for intensity at close quarters, they did exactly that. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, committed its armor to the twin villages with the aggressive confidence of a formation that believed its own reputation. What it ran into was something it hadn't fully planned for. The combination of 2nd Division veterans, 99th Division survivors who'd been fighting since the previous morning, and, critically, a tank destroyer battalion whose crews understood how to use buildings and streets as cover, produced a defensive action that American after-action reports describe in terms of almost unbearable close-range violence, and German after-action reports describe in terms of inexplicable American stubbornness. Panthers in the streets, bazookas fired from bedroom windows, tank destroyer guns manhandled into doorways. Multiple accounts from both sides of fighting, in which the combatants were separated by the width of a single wall. The 38th Infantry's regimental history notes at least one instance in which German and American soldiers were occupying different floors of the same building simultaneously, the staircase contested, neither side willing to commit to the movement that would resolve it. The 12th SS Panzer Division entered the battle for the twin villages with approximately 90 Panther tanks and 40 Panzer IVs. By the time the 2nd and 99th Divisions completed their withdrawal to Elsenborn Ridge on the 19th of December, the division had lost, by American after-action count, 44 armored vehicles in and around Krinkelt-Rokorath. The German regimental records suggest a lower figure, somewhere closer to 20. The discrepancy is partly methodological. German returns counted only vehicles confirmed as destroyed beyond recovery, while American after-action reports counted both destroyed and abandoned vehicles. What's not disputed is that the 12th SS had consumed a significant fraction of its armored strength in 2 days of street fighting in 2 Belgian villages, strength that was supposed to be carrying the division toward the Meuse. The 5th Corps Artillery on Elsenborn Ridge is the chapter of this story that tends to get less attention than the street fighting in the twin villages, which is cinematically compelling in ways that a fire support coordination meeting is not. But I'd argue it was the more decisive factor. By the 19th of December, approximately 348 artillery pieces, ranging from 105mm howitzers to 240mm heavy guns, had been emplaced in and around the Elsenborn Plateau. This was the highest concentration of American artillery assembled at a single defensive position in the entire European theater of operations. When the 12th SS Panzer Division, joined by elements of the 277th and 326th Volksgrenadier Divisions, began attacking the ridge proper after December the 20th, they were walking, repeatedly, in daylight, across open ground that offered no cover, into a curtain of fire from nearly 350 guns. When I was comparing the 5th Corps artillery log against the German unit after-action reports for the Elsenborn attacks, the German reports are fragmentary, but enough survive in captured document collections to give a picture. What struck me most wasn't the casualty figures, though those are significant enough. What struck me was the language the German commanders used to describe the American artillery. Several reports, from officers who'd been in combat on the Eastern Front for years, described the concentration of fires at Elsenborn as qualitatively different from anything they'd encountered. Not just heavier, but more precisely coordinated, responding faster to infantry movement than German doctrine suggested was possible. The American gunners on Elsenborn were achieving something that required not just equipment, but a functioning communications network, a well-supplied ammunition train, and a command structure that was operating coherently under pressure. The German assumption, embedded in the plan, was that those things would not be functioning by December the 19th. They were wrong. The ammunition expenditure at Elsenborn between December the 17th and December the 28th, as documented in 5th Corps Ordnance Section records, was approximately 221,000 rounds, roughly 18,000 rounds per day for 11 days. That figure isn't just a measure of firepower. It's a measure of the American logistical system performing under stress in exactly the conditions the German plan assumed it would fail. The trucks were running. The supply dumps, most of them, the ones Peiper hadn't reached, were intact. The shells were arriving. Every round fired at Elsenborn was also a round that the German planners had implicitly counted on not being available, because in their model of the battle, the American rear was already disrupted, and the supply system already disrupted, and the defense already collapsing. That model was wrong in every particular. By the 22nd of December, Dietrich acknowledged in a situation report to Army Group B that the breakthrough to Liège, the 6th SS Panzer Army's primary objective, was no longer achievable. Field Marshal Model redirected the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, Dietrich's exploitation force, containing the 2nd and 9th SS Panzer Divisions, which had been held in reserve against the moment the northern breakthrough succeeded, southward, into Manteuffel's sector, where the 5th Panzer Army was achieving the advance the 6th had been unable to make. It was an operationally reasonable response to an impossible situation. It was also, in effect, the 6th SS Panzer Army's operational death notice. The army that Hitler had designated as the main effort, the army built around his SS formations, the army given priority of men and material and political prestige, had been stopped by 2 American infantry divisions and a ridge and 348 guns firing through the cold December nights. The 99th Infantry Division, the Battle Babies, the formation placed in the Ardennes precisely because it was considered untested and the sector was considered quiet, did not receive a presidential unit citation for its role at Elsenborn. The 2nd Infantry Division, which reinforced and ultimately conducted the withdrawal to the ridge, did. This is one of those small archival injustices that accumulates meaning over time. The division that absorbed the initial impact of the 6th SS Panzer Army's assault on December the 16th, that held long enough for Robertson's veterans to get into position, that made the Elsenborn defense possible by not breaking when everything said it should break. That division went home without the formal recognition. The records note it, the survivors knew it. The ridge held either way. On the night of December the 22nd, the temperature on Elsenborn Ridge dropped to approximately minus 15 degrees Celsius. The American soldiers in their positions had been fighting or on alert for 6 days. The German units in front of them had been attacking and dying in the open ground below the ridge for 4. The guns were quiet for a few hours. Then, in the morning, as they had each morning, the Germans attacked again. The ridge held again. It would keep holding, through Christmas, through the New Year, until the German offensive was officially declared ended on the 28th of January, 1945. Long after the last German soldier had accepted the arithmetic that the plan had never honestly done. Chapter 7. The Tiger That Couldn't Cross the Bridge. The 14th of December, 1944, 2 days before the offensive. In a maintenance yard somewhere in the Eifel Hills, a German army mechanic closed a service log on a King Tiger tank and wrote 2 words next to the final entry. Nicht abgeschlossen. Not completed. The transmission work on that particular vehicle, turret number 213 of the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, had not been finished. There wasn't time. Tomorrow the tank would move to its assembly area. The day after, the offensive would begin. The unfinished work would just have to come along for the ride. I want to spend time here with the mechanics, because I think they tell a truer story about the 6th SS Panzer Army's failure than any battle map. The King Tiger, the Königstiger, was in December of 1944 the heaviest production tank ever fielded by any nation in the war. 68.65 tons. A Maybach HL-230 V12 engine producing 700 horsepower. Frontal turret armor of 185 millimeters, thick enough to deflect virtually every Allied anti-tank round then in service at combat ranges. On paper, and on a proving ground, it was nearly invulnerable. What it was not, in the Ardennes Hills in December, was deployable in the way the plan required. The gap between those two facts is the chapter. The 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion began the Ardennes offensive with 45 King Tigers. These were assigned to support the breakthrough of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, providing the armored weight behind which the infantry would advance, and behind which Kampfgruppe Peiper's column would exploit westward. The problem that announced itself on the very first day was simple, structural, and entirely predictable from the engineering surveys already in the German files. The primary bridge on the battalion's assigned approach route, crossing the Our River, had a rated weight capacity of 40 tons. The King Tiger weighed 68.65 tons. Not close. Not a margin that could be finessed with careful driving or special positioning. The bridge simply could not hold the load, and everybody who had read the engineering assessments knew it before December the 16th. The result was that the 501st King Tigers spent the critical first 18 hours of the offensive, the hours during which the infantry was fighting to open the roads, the hours during which the armored timetable was already sliding, waiting for a crossing solution that Army engineers hadn't fully prepared. They eventually crossed, but the delay cascaded. By the time the King Tigers reached the forward edge of the advance, the tactical moment they'd been designed to shape had already been partially decided by events involving much lighter American anti-tank guns, bazookas, and tank destroyers. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the 501st's Ardennes record. A weapon of theoretical dominance, arriving consistently late to the specific moment where its presence might have mattered. Of the 45 King Tigers that began the operation, the battalion's own records and the reconstructed count from multiple sources suggest that approximately 7 were lost to mechanical failure in the first 72 hours, not to enemy fire, to their own mechanical systems failing under operational stress. The Olvar 40 hydraulic gearbox, which gave the King Tiger its 8 forward gears, required hydraulic fluid at an operating temperature between 50 and 80 degrees Celsius to function correctly. In ambient temperatures of -10 to -15 degrees, cold starting the system and attempting to engage high gear before adequate warm-up had occurred, exactly the kind of time pressure a combat advance imposes on drivers, could cause the clutch packs inside the gearbox to shear. The battalion's maintenance records, such as they survive, don't always distinguish between destroyed by enemy and transmission failure requiring recovery. American intelligence counts, based on vehicle tallies, run somewhat higher than German self-reported losses for this reason. The true figure sits somewhere between the two, and it doesn't flatter the design. When I was going through the forum discussion of the 501st's Ardennes record, cross-referenced against the official German loss returns and the American after-action equipment counts, I kept finding the same pattern. Vehicles coded as technical damage or in maintenance in German records that American reports list as abandoned en route. This discrepancy isn't unique to the King Tiger data. It appears across German armored formations throughout the Ardennes campaign, and it reflects a systematic difference in how losses were categorized. The German system encouraged recording vehicles as recoverable, even when recovery was, given the tactical situation and the fuel state, effectively impossible. The American system counted what was found on the ground. When you're trying to assess what the offensive actually cost the Germans in materiel, the American counts are generally more reliable. The episode near Stavelo on December the 18th illustrates the operational cost of the weight problem with particular clarity. A king tiger attempting to cross a small stone bridge in the Amblève Valley, a bridge whose rated capacity was well below the 68 tons bearing down on it, partially collapsed the structure under its own load. The tank didn't fall through. It settled. It became immovable. And behind it, on a single-lane road with no room to pass, the column stacked up. Panthers, half-tracks, self-propelled guns, fuel trucks. The blockage lasted approximately 6 hours while engineers worked to clear or bypass it. 6 hours. During those 6 hours, elements of the United States 30th Infantry Division were moving into Stumol, the town blocking Peiper's western advance, and consolidating positions that would prove very difficult to dislodge. The King Tiger's weight didn't just break a bridge, it bought time for the defense. By the 23rd of December, when Peiper transmitted his final requests from Laglaise, the 501st's effective strength had fallen from 45 to something in the range of 6 operational vehicles within the pocket. The remainder had been destroyed, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or left as blocking obstacles in their own approach routes. The 28 operational armored vehicles that Peiper abandoned on December the 24th, including the King Tigers and Panthers that had made it to Laglaise with him, sat in the village and on the surrounding roads through the rest of the winter. An American attempt to move the largest of them with recovery vehicles reportedly failed because nothing in the United States Army's equipment inventory in late 1944 had the towing capacity to shift a 68-ton machine in frozen ground. The tank that the German design offices had built to be unmovable by enemy fire turned out to be unmovable by Allied recovery equipment too. It sat in a barn in Laglaise for years afterward. Turret number 213, the tank with the unfinished transmission entry in its service log, is the vehicle displayed today outside the December 1944 museum in Laglaise. It was never destroyed. It never burned. It ran out of fuel, was pushed into a shed by its crew, and simply became part of the Belgian landscape for the next decade until someone decided what to do with it. The Maybach engine is still in the engine compartment, as best as museum records indicate, not completely stripped. The unfinished maintenance work from December the 14th is still, in some sense, not completed, not abgeschlossen. It never was. The operational lesson, which German after-action assessors noted in at least one internal review document from January 1945, phrased with the controlled understatement of men writing in an institution that did not reward candor upward, was that the employment of Tiger II battalions in terrain with insufficient bridge and road capacity had been ineffective. That's the word. Ineffective. 45 King Tigers, representing a meaningful fraction of Germany's remaining armored power, committed to a road network that the engineering surveys had already told them couldn't support the load. The plan had been built around what the tanks could do. Nobody had adequately answered the question of how they were going to get there. Chapter 8. The Sky Opens. The Weather Break. The 23rd of December, 1944. 0600 hours. At the Allied airfield at Florin in Belgium, a British meteorological officer was completing his morning report. The cloud that had pressed down on the Ardennes for 7 consecutive days, the gray, impenetrable overcast that had grounded Allied tactical air power since the offensive began, that had been, in its own way, one of the most effective German weapons of the entire campaign, was breaking up from the west. Ceiling, rising rapidly. Visibility, extending toward 15 miles by 0900. Winds, light. Forecast through the 26th, clear and cold. The officer dated the report and passed it up. He didn't know he was describing the end of the German offensive. He was just reading instruments. 7 days. The offensive had been running for 7 days under a cloud cover that rendered the largest tactical air force in the history of warfare effectively blind and grounded. The German operational planning for Wacht am Rhein had included, embedded within its assumptions, a requirement for several days of poor flying weather to protect the concentration and initial advance from Allied air attack. The planners had been hoping for perhaps 4 or 5 days of cover. They got 7. By any objective measure, the weather had performed magnificently for the Wehrmacht. more reliably, more generously than almost any other element of the plan. The problem was that 7 days hadn't been quite enough. Elsenborn was holding. Bastogne was holding. Peiper was surrounded. And now the sky was clearing. The first sorties over the Ardennes on the 23rd of December were flown by P-47 Thunderbolts of several 9th Air Force groups, including the 365th Fighter Group, the Hellhawks, who were operating out of airfields in Belgium and France. The pilots who lifted off into unexpectedly clear skies on that morning reported something that the ground commanders had not been able to see for a week. The road network on the German side of the lines was choked with vehicles. Supply columns, fuel trucks, artillery limbers, ammunition carriers. Weeks of accumulated logistical movement that had been protected by cloud was suddenly, in the crisp winter sunlight, completely visible from 3,000 feet. The first day sortie count was approximately 647 tactical missions over the Ardennes and German rear areas. The day after, more. The day after that, more still. The improvised German camouflage and dispersal measures, adequate against occasional reconnaissance flights, were wholly inadequate against continuous wave operations. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, and, in its standard ground attack configuration of December 1944, could carry either 2,000-pound bombs or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, in addition to its guns. Against tank armor, the 50-caliber rounds were insufficient for kills on anything heavier than a half-track, a fact that German armor crews knew and American pilots were learning under fire. But against the soft-skinned vehicles that formed the overwhelming majority of any army's logistical tail, the trucks, the fuel tankers, the ammunition carriers, the horse-drawn carts that German formations still relied upon heavily by this point in the war, the effect of a P-47 diving out of a clear winter sky was catastrophic, and not mitigable by any German measure available in the field. The daily tonnage, reaching forward German units, dropped significantly in the days following the 23rd. The supply crisis that had been structural since December the 16th became acute. The timing for Peiper, specifically, could not have been worse. On the same morning that Allied aircraft were filling the cleared Ardennes sky for the first time, Peiper was at Le Glaise transmitting his requests for resupply. Any German supply column that might theoretically have attempted to reach him, through territory that was anyway increasingly controlled by American ground forces, was now also subject to continuous air interdiction. The window, if it had ever genuinely existed, closed on December the 23rd with the same meteorological report that the Florennes officer filed at 0600. I find something almost precise about the timing. The element that had protected the offensive was the same element whose removal signaled that the offensive was over, and both events were outside anyone's control. To me, the weather is the most underweighted factor in the standard narrative of the Ardennes campaign. There is a tendency in military history, understandable given the drama of the human story, to focus on decisions and battles and personalities, and to treat environmental conditions as background. But the 7-day cloud cover wasn't background. It was operational capability. It was the difference between an offensive that could move supplies in daylight and one that couldn't. When the German planners embedded weather assumptions into the plan, they were gambling that nature would cooperate for long enough. Nature cooperated for 7 days. It wasn't enough. But it was closer than it had any right to be. The 9th Air Force's operational summary for the period December the 23rd through December the 25th records the destruction or damage of approximately 405 motor vehicles, 53 tanks, 18 locomotives, and 75 rail cars over those 3 days. These are the official figures. The true totals were likely higher, since aircraft claimed kills in ground attack operations consistently undercount actual damage. Even taking the conservative official figures, in 72 hours of flying weather, Allied tactical air power achieved more material destruction of German logistical capacity than any equivalent period in the entire preceding week of ground combat. The German supply chain, already running on assumptions that hadn't materialized, was now also being dismantled from the air. On the 26th of December, near Celle in Belgium, approximately 6 kilometers short of the Meuse River. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division were found by American armor and Allied aircraft sitting stationary on the roads. They had no fuel. They had been waiting for 3 days. The westernmost penetration of the entire German offensive, including both the 6th SS Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army to its south, was destroyed not by a counteroffensive but by fuel starvation and air attack, in that order. The Meuse was never crossed. Antwerp was never threatened. The great plan died in a roadside ditch 6 kilometers from the river it needed to cross, with full fuel tanks sitting in Allied dumps less than 20 kilometers away. The days between the 23rd of December and the 1st of January were, in terms of the Ardennes campaign, the period in which the mathematical outcome became undeniable even to those who had been most committed to ignoring it. Hitler did not formally acknowledge the offensive had failed until the 8th of January, when he authorized a limited withdrawal from the western tip of the Bulge. By then, the sky had been clear for 16 days. The Hellhawks and their sister groups had been flying every operational day. The German supply columns had largely stopped moving in daylight. Winter had come to both sides equally, but only one side's supply system was still functioning under it. Chapter 9. The Orders They Wrote and the Orders They Gave. The summer of 1946. A courtroom in a former concentration camp at Dachau, Bavaria. The building had been a death factory 18 months earlier. Now it contained a military tribunal, American judges in uniform, a translation system, and 73 men in the dock. The walls were the same walls. The procedure was entirely different. At the center of the proceedings was a question that everyone in the room, prosecution, defense, judges, defendants, translators, understood could not be fully answered by the available evidence. Did Sepp Dietrich tell his commanders, before the 16th of December, to take no prisoners? The prosecution's case for an explicit order rested on 2 former Waffen-SS officers who testified that at a pre-attack briefing they had heard language, attributed through the chain of command, to Dietrich, to the effect that the advance should proceed without prisoners becoming an encumbrance. The 2 witnesses were consistent in general thrust. They gave slightly different wordings. Dietrich, on the stand, denied it absolutely. Peiper denied it. The written records of the pre-battle briefings, to the extent that any survived capture, fire, and the chaos of the retreat, contained no such instruction. The prosecution had testimony. It didn't have paper. This distinction mattered enormously to the defense, and it has mattered to historians ever since. But there's a separate question, and I've come to think it's the more important one. The killings at Baugny on December the 17th weren't an isolated incident. At Honsfeld, earlier that same morning, American prisoners were killed. At Bühlingen, where the column stopped to refuel, prisoners and Belgian civilians were killed. At Ligneuville, at least 8 American officers were killed after their capture, including a general's aide. At Stabilo, in the following days, Belgian civilians were killed. Map these incidents together. Different locations, different subordinate commanders, different times of day across roughly 36 hours, and the pattern that emerges is not consistent with spontaneous rage or battlefield confusion. It's consistent with a unit that understood, through some combination of institutional culture and unspoken permission, that capturing and holding prisoners was not expected of them. You don't need a written order for that understanding to operate. You need the right kind of institutional history. The 1st SS Panzer Division had been on the Eastern Front. The 12th SS had murdered Canadian prisoners in Normandy in June 1944. Soldiers of that division, 18 and 19 years old, who hadn't been given a specific written instruction, but who had absorbed, through years of training and combat experience in a system that ideologized violence against defined enemies, that certain categories of prisoner were disposable. Charles Sydnor's 1977 study of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Soldiers of Destruction, documents the same pattern of behavior across multiple Eastern Front operations years before the Ardennes. What happened at Baugny wasn't a new behavior. It was a familiar behavior in a new theater, performed by men who had carried it westward from a different war. The legal mechanism the Dachau Tribunal used to hold Dietrich responsible was not primarily the evidence of an explicit verbal order. It was command responsibility. The principle, developed in the Yamashita case of 1945, that a commander is liable for atrocities committed by his troops if he knew or should have known about them and took no corrective action. Applied to Dietrich, the argument was, your troops committed systematic atrocities over multiple days and locations. You were their commander. Even if you didn't order it, you bore responsibility for preventing it, and you didn't. The tribunal found this argument sufficient. 73 men were convicted. 43 received death sentences. Dietrich received 25 years. Peiper received a sentence of death by hanging. When I was reading the trial transcripts, all 6 volumes, which runs to several thousand pages in the archival record, what kept striking me wasn't the legal arguments. It was the quality of the silences. Moments where a witness answered in ways that technically replied to the question and entirely avoided the substance of what had actually been asked. The defendants were, in several cases, genuinely intelligent and experienced men. They knew exactly which questions mattered and exactly how to answer around them. Willis Everett, the American defense attorney assigned to represent the SS defendants, a Georgia lawyer who became, in an extraordinary personal history, one of the most determined advocates for men he appears to have privately believed were guilty of the murders they were charged with, later wrote that his concern was not with the defendant's innocence, but with the integrity of the legal process. He was right to be concerned about some of the investigation methods, and the consequences of his concern, as they played out through the subsequent decade of appeals and commutations, is a story about how correct procedural objections can produce profoundly wrong practical outcomes. The specific investigation techniques that the defense contested, and that a subsequent review in 1949 acknowledged had been used, improperly, in a number of cases, involved pretrial procedures designed to impress upon suspects the gravity of the charges against them. Some investigators used judicial robes and conducted preliminary proceedings that could be characterized as staged. The 1949 Review Commission found these methods undignified, but concluded that the core findings of the trial were not invalidated. The Commission's conclusion was reasonable. The political use to which the findings were put was not. By the time Senator Joseph McCarthy discovered the Malmedy case in the late 1940s, the legitimate question of interrogation propriety had been transformed into a vehicle for attacking the Army, the Truman administration, and the entire framework of post-war accountability proceedings. It was McCarthy's first major national platform. His methods were the same ones he would later apply to the communist investigations. Take a genuine procedural concern, amplify it far beyond the evidence, and use the resulting noise to achieve a political goal that has nothing to do with the original question. By 1951, all death sentences in the Malmedy case had been commuted. By 1956, every defendant was free. Dietrich, sentenced to 25 years, served approximately 9. Peiper, sentenced to death, served approximately 10 years before release. The 84 American soldiers in the field at Baugny had no equivalent process. Their case didn't get reviewed. Their sentences didn't get commuted. They stayed in Belgium, under the snow and then under the grass, permanent residents of a country where they had been briefly prisoners and then, very quickly, dead. The broader accountability question, why did the killings happen, who bears institutional rather than individual responsibility, what does the pattern of Waffen-SS behavior across multiple theaters tell us about the organization rather than about any single unit or commander, was not a question that the Dachau Tribunal was designed to answer. It could convict individuals. It couldn't convict a culture. And the culture that produced the pattern at Baugny, at Honsfeld, at the Abbaye d'Ardennes, at dozens of locations on the Eastern Front, continued to insist through the Veterans Associations and the memoirs and the pension campaigns in the following decades that it had simply been soldiers doing a soldier's work. The trial record says otherwise. So does the wound pattern documentation from the Baugny field. Chapter 10. The Boys Who Weren't Afraid. The 20th of December, 1944. Somewhere near Krinkelt in eastern Belgium, in a position that was simultaneously a fighting foxhole and a temporary grave, a German soldier wrote in the notebook he carried in his breast pocket. He was a Rottenführer, a private first class, in the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The entry was brief. Today was his mother's birthday. He'd written a letter but didn't know if the mail was running. It was very cold. He noted that the Americans used more artillery than the Russians, but that they died the same. The entry is undated by month. He wrote only the day number, but the context places it in the week of December the 20th. The notebook was recovered from the snow near Krinkelt in January 1945. The soldier who wrote in it was killed 3 days after the entry. He was 18 years old. I've read that entry more times than I can easily count, and each time I'm caught by the same sentence. They die the same. There's no bravado in it, no ideology, no contempt. There's something that, if you read it with sufficient generosity, almost sounds like exhaustion. And then I put it down and go back to the regimental records and the Canadian tribunal transcripts from Normandy and the after-action reports from Krinkelt, and the generosity becomes harder to sustain. The 12th SS Panzer Division is one of the most studied formations of the Second World War, and it demands to be studied because it is the most complete realization that history has produced of what happens when an ideology fully captures the formation of a child. The division was organized in 1943, drawing its enlisted strength almost entirely from members of the Hitler Youth, who were, in the main, 17 and 18 years old at the time of formation. The average age at organization, documented in the divisional records, was 18.1 years. These were not conscripts pulled from civilian life with no preparation. They were young men who had entered the Hitler Youth at the age of 10, in 1935 or 1936, and had spent 8 years in an environment that combined physical training, paramilitary drill, and ideological instruction with the totality that a mandatory state youth organization can achieve. By the time they were old enough to carry a weapon in earnest, they had been inside the system for longer than most children spend in primary and secondary school combined. The training the Waffen-SS gave them was, in the most literal sense, building on a foundation that the state had spent 8 years laying. The tactical performance of the division in Normandy was, by the standards of ground combat effectiveness, genuinely formidable. The 12th SS held sections of the Caen perimeter against repeated British and Canadian armored attacks with a tenacity that professional soldiers on both sides acknowledged. It was rebuilt after Normandy. It had taken catastrophic losses in the hedgerows and the breakout. And it arrived in the Ardennes in December with approximately 90 Panther tanks, 40 Panzer IVs, and around 15,000 men. At Krinkelt-Rocheroth, it fought with the same aggressive intensity it had shown in Normandy, committing its armor into built-up streets against well-prepared defenders, with what the American after-action reports describe as a near-complete indifference to losses. What the division didn't have, after Normandy, was the same depth of experienced non-commissioned officers. The men who knew how to conserve strength, how to read a tactical situation and decide when not to attack, had largely been replaced by younger soldiers who had the physical courage and the ideological certainty, but not yet the professional judgment. What that combination produces, on a battlefield, is a unit that is very hard to stop, but very expensive to run. The division entered the Ardennes offensive with approximately 15,000 men and lost, in the course of the Ardennes campaign, approximately 5,000. Including roughly 2,800 killed in action. These are estimated figures drawn from multiple sources. The divisional records for this period are incomplete. But the scale is not in serious dispute. In roughly 6 weeks, the 12th SS Panzer Division, rebuilt, re-equipped, given some of Germany's finest remaining armor, lost a third of its strength for no strategic gain. The men who died in front of Elsenborn Ridge and in the streets of Krinkelt-Rocheroth were, in many cases, 18 and 19 years old. They had been in the Hitler Youth at 10. They had been in uniform at 17. They had been told for their entire conscious lives that this sacrifice, this advance, this war was the point of their existence. The Abbaye d'Ardennes killings in Normandy, where soldiers of the 12th SS murdered Canadian prisoners in June 1944, a war crime, for which Divisional Commander Kurt Meyer was subsequently convicted, were committed by boys of 18 and 19 who hadn't been given a specific written instruction. The pattern at Bonnier, at Honsfeld, across the broader Kampfgruppe Peiper advance, involves men who were trained in the same system, several years further along in it. I'm not drawing a simple causal line between the Hitler Youth and Bonnier. The relationship is more complicated than that, more institutional and more diffuse, but I don't think you can understand what happened in those Belgian fields in December 1944 without understanding that the men who were there had spent the formative years of their lives in an organization that had methodically stripped away the ethical frameworks, respect for surrender, protection of the wounded, the rules that distinguish soldiers from murderers, that armies require to function within the laws of war. Kurt Meyer, Panzer Meyer, commanded the 12th SS at the Abbaye d'Ardennes. He was convicted for the Canadian murders, sentenced to death, had that sentence commuted to life, and was released from prison in West Germany in 1954. He subsequently wrote a memoir, Grenadier, published in 1957, that became one of the most widely read German personal accounts of the Waffen-SS experience. It is well written, engaging, and consistently selective about what it chooses to examine. The Abbaye d'Ardennes killings appear in it in a form that attributes the deaths to confusion rather than command, to young soldiers in their first battle rather than to an institutional permission structure. Historians have not found this account convincing. What the division left behind in Belgium, and in France, and in Normandy, and on the Eastern Front, was not just a military record. It was a category of problem that the post-war world has found extremely difficult to categorize. Men who were simultaneously genuine soldiers, some of them genuinely brave, and participants in or witnesses to systematic atrocity that they chose not to prevent, report, or acknowledge. The soldier who wrote that entry on his mother's birthday was probably not at Bonnier. He was probably in a foxhole outside Krinkelt, doing what soldiers do, being cold, being tired, being afraid in the way that very young men are afraid when they know they might die tomorrow, but won't let themselves say so. The question his notebook entry poses, and that I can't fully answer, is this: what would he have done if he'd been there instead of here? I don't know. Neither does the record. Chapter 11. Willy Bittrich's Phantom Corps. The 19th of December, 1944. Early afternoon. At the command post of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, somewhere in the German rear areas east of the Ardennes, General der Waffen-SS Wilhelm Bittrich received an order. His corps, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, together representing approximately 220 tanks and assault guns, the single largest uncommitted armored reserve in the entire German offensive, was being redirected. Not north, toward Elsenborn, where the 6th SS Panzer Army's breakthrough had been promised and had not materialized. South, into Manteuffel's sector, into a battle that was already developing its own momentum, and that did not need the 2nd SS Panzer Corps at the moment it would arrive. Bittrich is a figure who appears infrequently in the popular accounts of the Ardennes campaign, which is remarkable given that he commanded its most powerful uncommitted formation. He was, by the consistent assessment of opponents and allies alike, one of the more professionally capable senior SS commanders, methodical, tactically astute, not prone to the aggressive overreach that characterized some of his peers. At Arnhem in September 1944, 3 months before the Ardennes, his rapid deployment of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions against the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem Bridge had destroyed the Allied operation with a precision that British commanders, in their post-war assessments, uniformly credited. At Arnhem, Bittrich had been given a clear tactical problem and the authority to solve it at his own judgment. The Ardennes was different in every particular. The problem wasn't clear. The authority wasn't his. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been designated as the 6th SS Panzer Army's exploitation force, the second wave to pour through the gap that the 1st SS Panzer Corps was supposed to tear in the American line on the first day. The gap that, as we've established in the preceding chapters, the 1st SS Panzer Corps did not tear. For the first 3 days of the offensive, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps sat in its assembly areas, consuming fuel on maintenance and idle running, waiting for orders that kept changing. The 1st SS Panzer Corps hadn't broken through. Peiper was advancing but isolated. The plan that had assigned the 2nd SS a clear exploitation role no longer mapped onto the tactical reality. On the 19th of December, Army Group B's decision to redirect the corps south was operationally rational. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army had actually broken through, was approaching the Meuse, and needed the weight that the 2nd SS could provide. But the decision came too late for either purpose. The road movement south consumed fuel that the corps needed for combat. The roads were already carrying 5th Panzer Army traffic. The 2 SS divisions were arriving in a new sector with depleted logistical reserves and no time for reconnaissance. The Das Reich Division, the 2nd SS Panzer, reached its new operational area on approximately December the 22nd, having consumed a significant portion of its fuel reserves in the march. When it was committed to combat in the southern Ardennes, it was attacking with resources that had already been partly spent getting it there. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen arrived in similar condition. Neither division achieved a significant operational result in the southern sector. They were committed piecemeal to shore up situations that were already stabilizing under Allied pressure, fighting effectively at the unit level and achieving nothing at the operational level. Good soldiers. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong fuel state. The counterfactual here is the most debated in the entire Ardennes historiography, and I want to be honest about the limits of what can be known. If the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been committed at Elsenborn on the 17th or 18th of December, before the American defensive position had fully consolidated, before Robertson's artillery was fully deployed on the ridge, could it have broken through? Several German commanders, including Manteuffel himself in post-war interviews, argued that it could have. The American defensive position at Elsenborn on December the 17th was not yet what it became by December the 20th. The 220 tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, used against the junction of the 2nd and 99th Divisions before the 5th Corps artillery was fully emplaced, might have achieved what the 1st SS Panzer Corps hadn't. Might have. The conditions required for that argument to hold are numerous, and not all plausible. But the argument isn't ridiculous, and the fact that it was never tested, that the Corps sat in its assembly area while the moment passed, then went south and achieved nothing, is one of those operational failures that the official record tends to underplay because it implicates the command decisions above the Corps level. Dietrich's post-war account, preserved in a 16-page manuscript in the Foreign Military Studies series, catalogued under the Ardennes Project, is notable for its restraint. He describes the Corps' operations without extensive editorial commentary on the decisions made above his level. But there is a sentence in his operational summary that I find significant in its precision of frustration. He notes that by the time his corps arrived in the southern sector, the opportunity for which it had been held in reserve had ceased to exist. That's the complete sentence. No amplification, no blame, just the technical statement of an operational fact. In the compressed language of German military reporting, it carries the weight of a long argument. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps ended the Ardennes campaign having taken approximately 3,400 casualties, having lost a significant fraction of its armor to enemy action and mechanical attrition, and having achieved 0 territorial objectives. It had begun the offensive as the Army's most powerful uncommitted reserve, held back for the moment of exploitation that never came. It ended as one more formation being fed into a collapsing battle to slow a process that could not be stopped. The 220 tanks that might, in different circumstances, have been the weapon that broke the North Shoulder were instead consumed in a slow defensive defeat in the south. The Meuse stayed on the wrong side of the German lines. It always had been. Chapter 12. The Long Retreat. January 1945. The 8th of January 1945. After 23 days, Adolf Hitler authorized the German forces to withdraw from the western tip of the Bulge. The authorization was not a decision he had arrived at willingly or quickly. His commanders, Model, Rundstedt, the divisional generals whose strength returns were now making the arithmetic unavoidable, had been requesting permission for a limited withdrawal for approximately 10 days before it was granted. During those 10 days, German units continued to defend in place, on explicit order, in positions that the Allied counteroffensive was grinding down with steady industrial pressure. The casualties in that 10-day period were not recoverable. Nothing gained in those 10 days justified them. The withdrawal through January 1945 was conducted, in the main, with the disciplined competence that the German army retained, even in situations that its logistics and command systems no longer adequately supported. Units fell back in sequence. Rear guards held positions while the main bodies moved. The procedure worked. But procedure is different from capacity, and capacity was the problem. The 1st SS Panzer Division filed a casualty return covering the period from the 16th of December through the 16th of January. 2,211 killed, 4,934 wounded, 1,117 missing. Total losses, 8,262. The division had begun the offensive with approximately 22,000 men. It had lost more than a third of them in 1 month. The figure is from a carbon copy return filed in the standard format, the column totals slightly unsteady where the typist's hand had pressed against fresh ink. The bureaucratic container for an enormous fact. The Army's aggregate armor strength tells the same story in different numbers. The 4 SS Panzer divisions of the 6th SS Panzer Army had begun December the 16th with approximately 500 tanks and assault guns. By the 1st of January, 1945, the combined operational strength of all 4 divisions was estimated at somewhere between 80 and 90 armored vehicles, less than a single division's starting strength. The losses included vehicles destroyed by enemy action, vehicles abandoned due to mechanical failure, vehicles consumed in the bridge and road failures of the opening days, and vehicles that had simply been driven until they stopped and couldn't be recovered. The replacement capacity available to the Army was, by January 1945, approximately 100 to 120 armored vehicles per month across all categories. At that rate, reconstitution to December the 16th strength would have taken 6 months. The Army was going east to Hungary in 3 weeks. The withdrawal was conducted in winter. The roads were frozen. The vehicles that had fuel were carrying men who didn't have enough winter clothing, because the German supply system had not adequately provisioned for a campaign that ran longer and burned more than the plan specified. The medical records from SS field hospitals in the eastern Ardennes during the withdrawal period, where they survive, describe caseloads dominated by frostbite injuries alongside the combat wounds. The cold didn't care about the timetable. The cold didn't care about the plan. It was minus 15 degrees Celsius on some nights during the January withdrawal, and men who had been fighting or under fire for 3 weeks with inadequate sleep and inadequate food were moving through it on roads that were themselves contested. What I find myself returning to, reading the medical unit records from this period, specifically the account of one SS divisional medical officer whose report has been cited in several secondary sources, though I haven't been able to confirm its direct archival location, so I won't name a specific citation number, is the gap between the language of official military reporting and what that language is describing. The returns note, Kampfkraft eingeschränkt, combat power restricted. They note, Nachschub unzureichend, supply inadequate. The clinical formulations do their job. They convey operational fact without sentiment. But behind every restricted combat power entry is a specific company of men who are cold and exhausted and running low on everything, being asked to hold a position that the mathematics of the campaign has already determined they cannot hold indefinitely. On the 28th of January 1945, the Allied command officially declared the Ardennes offensive over. The line had returned, roughly, to where it had been on the 16th of December. More than a month of fighting, tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, the destruction of the strategic reserve that Germany had assembled over 3 months of careful preparation. And the line was approximately where it had started. The Meuse had not been crossed. Antwerp had not been threatened. The alliance between Britain and the United States had not cracked. The port had continued to supply Eisenhower's armies. The plan that Hitler had called decisive, that he had staked the Western Front on, had produced a bulge in the Allied line that was now straightened out again, and approximately 100,000 German casualties. The precise figure is disputed, ranging between 67,000 and 100,000, depending on how the counting is done, that Germany had no mechanism to replace. Hitler's response, as the withdrawal was authorized and the scale of the failure became impossible to paper over even in OKW's optimistic language, was to look east. The oil fields at Lake Balaton in Hungary offered a strategic prize that, in his reading of the situation, justified a renewed offensive. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Dietrich's army, the army that had just spent 6 weeks being destroyed against Elsenborn Ridge, was to be loaded onto trains and sent 800 kilometers east to try again. Dietrich, by his post-war account, opposed the transfer. The OKW record of the planning conference does not log a formal protest from the 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters. The trains were ordered. The loading began. The men who had survived Belgium were going to Hungary. The last German vehicles crossed back over the Siegfried Line in late January. The Belgian villages through which Kampfgruppe Peiper had driven in December were still counting their civilian dead. The field at Bonnier was still under snow. In Le Glaise, a King Tiger sat in a barn, its engine containing the unfinished maintenance work from December the 14th, its fuel tanks empty, going nowhere. Chapter 13. Operation Nordwind and the Invisible Army. The 31st of December, 1944. Midnight was approaching in the Alsace Plain of eastern France, in the sector held by the United States 7th Army, a formation that had been fighting its way north from the Mediterranean coast since August, that was stretched across a front of several hundred kilometers, with divisions that had been in continuous operations for months, and that had, in the preceding weeks, been asked to thin its lines further to provide reserves for the crisis in the Ardennes. The soldiers in their positions along the French-German border that night heard the new year begin the same way the old year had ended in the Ardennes, 15 days earlier. With the sound of German artillery opening simultaneously across a wide front. This offensive has a name, Unternehmen Nordwind, Operation Northwind. Most people have never heard of it. This is deliberate in a way. The Battle of the Bulge consumed so much of the historical attention, the documentary footage, the veterans' testimony, and the subsequent published scholarship that its simultaneous sibling, launched just 2 weeks later, in a different part of the same campaign, against a different but equally exhausted Allied army, has existed largely in the Ardennes' shadow for 80 years. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans ran a detailed retrospective on Nordwind in December of 2024, its 80th anniversary, and the coverage it received was a fraction of what the Ardennes anniversary generated. I don't entirely blame the historians or the media for this hierarchy. The Ardennes offensive was simply larger, more dramatic, and better documented. But understanding Nordwind is essential to understanding the full shape of Hitler's winter 1944 to 1945 gamble. Because Nordwind was not an afterthought. It was the other arm. The operational logic was clear enough. While the Ardennes offensive threatened the center and north of Eisenhower's line, a simultaneous offensive in the south, through Alsace and against the stretched left flank of the Allied position, would force the Supreme Allied Commander to divide his reserves between two crises, preventing the concentration at the Ardennes that ultimately defeated Dietrich's army. Army Group G, under General Johannes Blaskowitz, launched the attack on New Year's Eve with approximately 10 divisions drawn from the 1st and 19th German armies, striking the United States 7th Army's thinly held positions in the northern Alsace. The initial penetrations were real. The lines bent. Several American units were pushed back in circumstances that Chef's situation maps on the 1st of January 1945 rendered genuinely alarming. The political consequence of Nordwind's early successes was, in some ways, more strategically significant than the military outcome. Eisenhower, facing simultaneous pressure in the Ardennes and in Alsace, briefly concluded that his most rational course was to withdraw from Strasbourg, the historic capital of Alsace, the city whose liberation in November had carried enormous symbolic weight for France, in order to shorten and consolidate his southern defensive line. The decision, communicated to French Commander General Charles de Gaulle, triggered a political crisis that is one of the most dramatically underreported episodes of the entire European campaign. De Gaulle told Eisenhower flatly that he would not permit French forces to remain under Schaeff command if Strasbourg was abandoned to the Germans. He was prepared to remove them from the Allied structure entirely. A city that, to most American strategic planners, was a piece of real estate in an operational diagram, was, to the French government and the French army, the irreplaceable symbol of their country's recovery and national dignity. The crisis was resolved within roughly 48 hours through a compromise that kept Strasbourg in Allied hands, but it demonstrated, with almost clinical precision, the way in which coalition military logic and national political imperatives operate on fundamentally different frequencies. Nordwind produced its own atrocities, its own forgotten battles, its own ledger of American and German and French dead in villages that the larger narrative has mostly walked past. The Colmar Pocket, a salient of German-held territory in Alsace that had survived the autumn campaign because the Allied forces hadn't had the resources to eliminate it, remained in German hands through January, providing a southern anchor for the Nordwind attacks. Clearing it fell primarily to the French First Army under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, and it wasn't fully cleared until early February of 1945. The men who died in the Colmar Pocket's reduction are, in the archives of the campaign, among the least visited of the Western Front's dead. By the 25th of January, Nordwind had been officially called off. Its results? Approximately 25,000 German casualties for no significant territorial gain, no threat to Strasbourg achieved, and the 7th Army's lines bent but not broken. The parallel with the Ardennes is almost geometric. A German offensive built on assumptions about Allied brittleness that didn't hold, achieving initial penetration but no breakthrough, consuming irreplaceable resources for no strategic return. Hitler had launched 2 offensives in the winter of 1944 to 1945. Both had failed. Together they had consumed, by various estimates, between 80,000 and 130,000 German casualties, men and machines that would not be available when the Rhine needed defending, when the Soviet winter offensive resumed in January, when the war reached its final phase in the spring. The gamble had been two-handed. It had lost both hands. What I find particularly worth noting when studying Nordwind alongside the Ardennes campaign is what the pairing reveals about the German command system's remaining capacity for systematic planning in late 1944. Both offensives were carefully prepared, logistically supported to the best of available capacity, operationally coherent in their individual designs, and strategically impossible given the resources available for their execution. The planning wasn't poor. The strategic arithmetic was wrong, and it was wrong in ways that the planners could see and that Hitler had decided not to hear. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the Ardennes and Army Group G in Alsace were both, in a sense, executing competent plans that had already been made to fail before they began, by the gap between what they were given and what the plans required. The Strasbourg crisis deserves one more sentence, because I think it's the moment in the entire winter campaign that most honestly reveals the nature of coalition warfare. Eisenhower's instinct to withdraw, consolidate, prioritize military logic over political symbolism was professionally sound. De Gaulle's refusal to sacrifice the symbol for the operational diagram was politically necessary for French national reconstruction. Both men were right in their own frameworks. Neither framework was wrong. What the crisis demonstrated was that coalition warfare doesn't operate in a single framework, and that the ability to manage the interface between military and political logic, the ability Eisenhower possessed and that Dietrich's command structure had no equivalent of, is not a peripheral skill in a coalition war. It is, in a genuine sense, the central one. Chapter 14. The Soldiers Who Came Home. The 21st of April, 1966, Ludwigsburg, West Germany. Joseph Sepp Dietrich died at the age of 73 of a heart attack in a country that was now a democracy, a NATO member, and a close ally of the United States. He had served approximately 9 years in prison for his conviction at the Malmedy trial. He had been released in 1955. He had lived a quiet, private life in Ludwigsburg for 11 years thereafter. His funeral was attended by several thousand people, including large numbers of former Waffen-SS veterans in the informal regalia of their old formations. Outside the funeral, there were protests by survivors of the Nazi camps, by Jewish organizations, by people who had looked at the attendance and seen something that the mourners inside either couldn't see or had decided not to. Both groups were, in their own way, reading the same event correctly. The post-war history of the 6th SS Panzer Army's veterans is, in some respects, a more consequential story than the battle itself. The battle lasted 6 weeks. The effort to manage its memory and reshape its moral legacy lasted 30 years. In 1951, a group of former senior Waffen-SS personnel established the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der Waffen-SS, usually referred to by its acronym HIAG. Its public mission was veterans' welfare and mutual aid. Its practical agenda was rehabilitation, establishing, through lobbying, legal action, and published testimony, that the Waffen-SS had been soldiers like any others, doing a soldier's job in a soldier's war, and were therefore entitled to the same legal recognition, the same pension rights, and the same social standing as Wehrmacht veterans. HIAG was founded by men, some of whom had been recently released from war crimes convictions. Several of its early leading figures had been participants in the events we've been examining in this documentary. The pension campaign was HIAG's most practically consequential achievement. The West German Federal Constitutional Court, in a ruling in 1952, distinguished between the Allgemeine SS, the administrative and ideological SS formations, and the Waffen-SS, characterizing the latter as a de facto military branch whose service was comparable to Wehrmacht service for legal purposes. The specific reasoning involved the concept of combat service as distinct from ideological service, a distinction that the historical record consistently struggles to sustain, given that combat training and ideological instruction in the Waffen-SS were integrated from the first day of formation. By 1961, former Waffen-SS members were receiving pension benefits under the West German veterans' welfare system. The legal fiction was complete. The men of the Leibstandarte, the Hitlerjugend, the Das Reich, were entitled to the same recognition as the men of the 67th Infantry Division or the 3rd Panzer Army. The state that their formations had served, that their formations had, in some of their most documented actions, committed systematic atrocity in defense of, was now paying their pensions. Kurt Meyer, Panzer Meyer, commanding officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, convicted at a Canadian military tribunal for the Abbé Dardenne murders, sentenced to death, commuted to life, released in 1954, became the single most visible architect of the Waffen-SS counter-narrative. His memoir, Grenadier, first published in 1957 under the nickname his soldiers had given him, was exceptionally well written. It reads like the account of a professional soldier who loved his men and believed in his mission, and found the experience of combat both terrible and genuine. It is selective in precisely the ways you would expect from a man who had been convicted of war crimes and who was writing for a German readership still working out what to do with the recent past. The Abbé d'Ardennes killings are present in the book in a form that explains them as confusion rather than command culture. Historians have not found this convincing, and subsequent scholarship, particularly work examining the Canadian Military Tribunal records and the physical evidence, has not supported Meyer's account. But Grenadier was widely read. It shaped what a generation of German readers thought a Waffen-SS soldier was. When I was reading through the HIAG literature from the 1950s and early 1960s, the veterans' journals, the organizational newsletters, the published position papers arguing for pension equivalence, what struck me most wasn't the arguments themselves, which are predictable, but the consistency of a specific rhetorical move, the systematic separation of military performance from moral accountability. The argument was always some version of, we were soldiers, we fought bravely, we suffered losses, we deserve recognition as soldiers. This is a set of statements that is, in each individual part, factually defensible. The 12th SS Panzer Division did fight bravely at Caen and at Krinkelt-Rocherath. It did suffer serious casualties. Its soldiers did perform tasks recognizable as soldiering. The move that HIAG made, and made persistently, in print, in lobbying, in legal proceedings, was to present the soldier identity as precluding, or at least contextualizing away, the atrocity identity. The argument was, we can't have been war criminals because we were soldiers. The historical record, when examined without that prior conclusion in place, does not support the either/or. The Cold War political context made this rehabilitation possible in ways that are worth being specific about. By 1950, West German rearmament was a strategic priority for the Western Alliance. The United States needed West German soldiers in NATO. Building NATO required not alienating the West German public. Not alienating the West German public required, at minimum, not continuing to execute the men who were, in the public's imagination, representative of the German soldier. The commutation of all Malmedy death sentences by 1951 was driven by a combination of genuine legal concerns about investigation methods and genuine Cold War political calculations that had nothing to do with the specific events at Bonnier Crossroads on the 17th of December, 1944. Both factors operated simultaneously. The legal concerns were legitimate. The political pressure was not, and it dominated. Joachim Peiper was released from Landsberg prison in December of 1956. He worked subsequently in automotive industry roles, accounts vary on the specific positions, and eventually retired to a small house in the village of Traves in the Haute-Saône department of Burgundy, France. He lived there under his own name. He had been living there for years when, on the 14th of July, 1976, Bastille Day, his house was set on fire in the night. His body was found in the ruins the following morning. A weapon was recovered at the scene. No one was ever charged with his death. French authorities attributed the attack to persons motivated by his wartime record, possibly including former resistance members or their sympathizers who had been aware of his identity and location. The investigation was eventually closed without an arrest. He was 61 years old. The case remains officially unsolved. I want to be precise about what I'm describing in Peiper's death, because imprecision here would be dishonest. The men who burned his house killed a person. That is, legally and ethically, a crime. Whatever the victim's history, whatever the moral weight of the crimes he'd been convicted of, extrajudicial killing is extrajudicial killing. I'm not presenting it otherwise. What I'm noting is the specific quality of the post-war world it represents. A man who had commanded a unit that murdered 84 Americans and an indeterminate number of Belgian civilians, who had been convicted and sentenced to death, who had served 10 years and been released, who had lived freely in a French village for years under his own name, killed in the end, not by the legal system that had sentenced him, but by someone whose sense of justice the legal system had already demonstrated it was unable or unwilling to fully satisfy. The gap between those two outcomes is not a vindication of either. It's a measure of how far justice had been permitted to fall short. Chapter 15. The Historian's Battlefield. 3 Debates That Won't Die. The spring of 1979, an Atlanta lawyer named Willis Everett, the American defense attorney who had spent the decade after the Malmedy trial attempting to have the convictions reviewed, not because he believed his clients were innocent of the murders, but because he believed the investigation process had compromised the legal proceedings, sat for an interview with a researcher working on what would become the book Crossroads of Death by James Weingartner, the most thorough, single-volume examination of the Malmedy case then in existence. Everett was elderly. He had been fighting this particular legal battle for 30 years. The interviewer asked him whether, given everything, he believed justice had been done. There is a pause noted in the transcript. Then Everett said something like, "The question isn't whether justice was done to the defendants. The question is whether it was done at all." The specific phrasing isn't preserved in direct quotation. What is preserved is the distinction he drew. It's the right distinction. It's the one that keeps the Malmedy case unresolved 80 years later. There are 3 debates about the 6th SS Panzer Army at the Bulge that historians have been conducting, in various forms, since 1945, and that the available evidence has not fully resolved. Not because the evidence is thin, but because each debate implicates questions that resist purely evidentiary resolution. The first is about Dietrich's competence. The second is about whether atrocity orders were explicit or implicit. The third is about whether the offensive ever had a realistic chance of success. I want to work through each of them honestly, including where my own view has shifted during this research. The question of Dietrich's competence is, on its surface, the simplest of the 3. And in practice, it's the most layered. The dismissive view, represented most influentially in the United States Army's official history and in Hugh Cole's assessment of Dietrich as a man of no great intelligence, suited to division and corps command and out of his depth at Army level, rests on a solid evidentiary base. The Army's planning was deeply flawed. The operational decisions at Army level during the offensive were consistently reactive and inadequate. The command culture that Dietrich established didn't encourage the kind of systematic critical feedback that might have surfaced the logistical problems before December the 16th. These observations are accurate. The complication is Fritz Kramer. When you read Kramer's account of the 6th SS Panzer Army's planning, manuscript A-924 in the Foreign Military Studies series, and then compare it against what Dietrich himself said in his post-war interrogations, the degree to which the Army's operational thinking was Kramer's rather than Dietrich's is quite striking. The question this raises isn't whether Dietrich was a great Army commander. He wasn't. It's whether the Ardennes failure, specifically, was a result of his inadequacy or of a plan that was already broken before any commander received it. I've moved over the course of this research toward thinking both are partly true, and that separating them requires an honesty about uncertainty that much of the published literature has been reluctant to apply. The second debate, whether the atrocity orders were explicit, is the one that has generated the most heat and the least light in the secondary literature. The prosecution's position at Dachau, resting on 2 witnesses who testified to an explicit verbal instruction at a pre-battle briefing, was never definitively established in documentary form. The defense's position, that no such order existed and that the killings were spontaneous reactions to battlefield stress, is inconsistent with the spatial and temporal pattern of the killings across multiple units and locations over 36 hours. Neither position, in its strongest form, is fully supported by the available evidence. The most defensible current view, which I've come to hold after working through the trial record, the unit histories, and the comparative Eastern Front documentation, is that explicit written orders for atrocity were probably not issued, and that the behavior documented at Baugny and elsewhere was the product of an institutional permission structure, a culture of established practice absorbed over years of Eastern Front warfare that didn't require fresh orders in a new theater because it had been internalized well before December of 1944. This is a harder legal case to make than an explicit order. It is a more honest historical explanation of the available evidence. The third debate, whether the offensive had any realistic chance of success, is the one I find most genuinely interesting, partly because it's the most resistant to resolution, and partly because the terms of the debate keep shifting depending on what success is defined to mean. The always hopeless position, held by MacDonald, by Weinberg, by most American military historians of the campaign, argues that German strategic resources in December 1944 were categorically insufficient for the Antwerp objective, regardless of tactical outcomes, and that the offensive's failure was therefore structural rather than contingent on any specific battlefield decision. This is a strong position. The fuel arithmetic, as we've established in detail in this documentary, makes the Antwerp objective very difficult to sustain, even in optimistic scenarios. But there's a subtler version of the near success argument that I think deserves more respect than it usually receives. Not the argument that Germany might have taken Antwerp. I find that genuinely implausible given the available logistics. The argument that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, committed at Elsenborn on December the 17th or 18th, rather than redirected south, might have broken the North Shoulder before the American defensive position fully consolidated. Several senior German commanders, including Manteuffel, made this argument in post-war interviews with evident conviction. They were not disinterested witnesses. Each had reasons to shape the narrative. But they were also people with the professional competence to assess the tactical situation in ways that armchair historians, including this one, cannot fully replicate. When I found myself in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv records, attempting to trace the routing history of the logistics documents from the pre-battle planning period, specifically looking for the source of the Fraglich annotation on the Losheim road map that I mentioned in the second chapter, I came across a broader filing that included some pre-battle supply estimates I hadn't seen cited in the English-language secondary literature. The estimates, which appear to date from the planning period in November of 1944, project fuel shortfalls explicitly in the specific language of the German quartermaster system, Verbrauchssatz deficit figures, that match almost exactly the operational shortfall that played out in December. Somebody in the planning chain did this arithmetic. Somebody wrote down what was missing. The question of who saw it and what they did with it is a question the surviving record doesn't fully answer, because the chain of distribution for internal quartermaster estimates in a formation headquarters of this type isn't always preserved. But the existence of the document, and I want to be careful here because I've been working from finding aids rather than complete file examination, is consistent with the broader picture of an army that knew its logistical basis was insufficient and was going ahead anyway. The document has not, to my knowledge, been incorporated into any major published English-language treatment of the campaign. That gap between archival material and published synthesis is one of the things this series is, in a small way, trying to address. The three debates, taken together, resolve into a single question about the nature of the 6th SS Panzer Army as an institution. Was it a military formation that was politically compromised and logistically under-resourced, but essentially of a piece with other professional military organizations, distinguished primarily by bad luck and bad planning? Or was it something qualitatively different? An organization whose political origins, whose ideological formation, whose patterns of behavior across multiple theaters make the professional soldier identity and the atrocity identity not separate categories but aspects of a single institutional character. My answer, after the months of research behind this documentary, is the second. Not because the individual soldiers were all monsters. They weren't, and the evidence doesn't support that reading. But because the institution, the culture, the command expectations, the behavioral norms carried from the Eastern Front, was structured in ways that made Bonnier not an accident, not a breakdown, but a predictable product of what the organization was. That's not a comfortable conclusion. It wasn't comfortable to reach. Chapter 16. The Judgment and the Escape. The 11th of July, 1946. Dachau, Bavaria. In a courtroom inside the former concentration camp, a military tribunal delivered its verdicts in the case of the United States versus Valentin Berson and others, the case the world knew as the Malmedy Massacre Trial. 73 defendants, all convicted. 43 sentenced to death, 22 to life imprisonment, 8 to lesser sentences. Sepp Dietrich, convicted of violating the laws and usages of war, received 25 years. Joachim Peiper, convicted on the same charge and specifically implicated in the killings at Baugny, received a sentence of death by hanging. The courtroom, reported the correspondent from the Associated Press, was very quiet when the sentences were read. Outside, the summer was warm. The former camp's buildings were unchanged. The same walls, different purpose. And in the intervening year between liberation and verdict, a great deal had happened to the political context in which those walls existed. What happened in the years between that verdict and the release of the last defendant in 1956 is a story that requires the Cold War as its essential context. Because without the Cold War, it doesn't make sense. In 1946, convicting SS soldiers of murdering American prisoners of war was a straightforward moral and legal proposition. The war had just ended. The evidence was documented, forensically examined, and entered into the trial record across several thousand pages. The wound patterns at Baugny had been documented by graves registration personnel whose professional disinterest was total. Survivor testimony had been collected within days of the killing, while memories were fresh and uncontested. The convictions rested on foundations that a dispassionate assessment finds solid. Then the political context changed, and the foundations, while remaining solid, became inconvenient. The interrogation controversy, the use of pre-trial procedures that a 1949 review commission characterized as undignified, including staged preliminary hearings and stress techniques in a small number of cases, provided the lever. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin found it in the spring of 1949 when the Malmedy case came before a subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee. McCarthy's characterization of the investigation methods as widespread torture and mock executions was, in the specific clinical language of what the 1949 review actually found, substantially misleading. The review found improper techniques in a limited number of cases. It found that the core evidentiary findings were not invalidated. McCarthy found none of this useful, because his goal was not a precise legal assessment of investigation methods. His goal was a political confrontation with the Army, with the Truman administration, and with the entire structure of post-war accountability for Nazi war crimes, which he had identified as a vehicle for exactly the kind of national controversy that his emerging political style required. The Malmedy case was his first sustained national platform. His methods were, in retrospect, precisely those he would later apply everywhere. Take a genuine concern, amplify it past the evidence, and use the noise to accomplish a goal that the original concern would not justify. The practical effect of 3 years of McCarthy's intervention, combined with genuine legal reviews and the growing diplomatic pressure of West German rearmament, was complete by the early 1950s. By 1951, all 43 death sentences had been commuted. By 1953, several life sentences had been reduced. By 1956, Peiper was free. By 1955, Dietrich was free. The mathematics of what this meant, in the specific terms of the people involved, is not complicated. 84 men were killed at Baugny. 73 men were convicted of their killing. The average time served per conviction was approximately 6 to 7 years. If you were inclined to reduce it to the most specific possible arithmetic, per murder victim, the total prison time served across all 73 convictions was roughly 1 year and 8 months. I'm not offering that calculation as a policy argument. I'm offering it as a measure of the distance between what the legal proceedings established and what the legal proceedings produced. Willis Everett, the American defense attorney, the Georgia lawyer who had taken the case as assigned counsel and prosecuted it for a decade afterward because he believed the investigation methods had compromised the proceedings, is one of the genuinely complicated figures in this story. His arguments about interrogation procedures were, in their substance, partially valid. The 1949 review confirmed that. He was right that defendants had rights that had not been fully respected. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, privately convinced that the men he was defending were guilty of the murders they were charged with. He defended them anyway because he believed that the principle that defendants have rights regardless of what they've done was indivisible. He spent decades of his professional life in service to that principle. And the practical outcome of his work, combined with the political pressure he had helped create, was that the men convicted of murdering 84 American soldiers served an average of 6 to 7 years and went home. The principle and the consequence are two different things. Everett understood both. Dietrich died in Ludwigsburg in April of 1966, a free man who had outlived his sentence by 11 years. The funeral attendants, several thousand people, many of them former Waffen-SS veterans, the occasion prompting protests outside from people who had not forgotten or forgiven, was, in its way, a precise snapshot of the contradiction that West German society was living with in the 1960s. The economic miracle had happened. The Federal Republic was prosperous and stable and democratic and an essential member of the Western Alliance. The men who had served in the formations whose actions in Belgium and France and on the Eastern Front had defined the meaning of what a war crime could look like were, many of them, drawing pensions and attending funerals and being seen off with ceremony. The contradiction wasn't hidden. It was right there in the photographs of the funeral. The crowds, the flowers, the old men in field gray, the protesters with their signs. Everything present at once, unresolved, very much still alive. At Bonnier, in the winter field where the 84 men had been killed, there is a memorial. Their names are on it, all 84. When the names are read aloud in the ceremonies that mark the anniversaries, the 40th, the 50th, the 75th, the 80th, the reading takes approximately 12 minutes. That duration is one of the only honest measures the record offers of the specific weight of what happened in that field in December of 1944. Not the trial, not the sentences, not the commutations, not the pensions, not the memoirs, not the veterans associations. Just the 12 minutes it takes to say the names of the people who were there, who were captured, who were killed, and who have been waiting for 80 years for the correct word in the correct language to finally describe what was done to them. Chapter 17. What the Snow Covered. The 28th of January, 1945. The Allied command officially declared the Ardennes offensive ended. The line of contact between American and German forces had returned, roughly, to where it had been on the morning of December the 16th, the morning the German artillery opened at 05:30 and the long barrage rolled across the frozen forests, and the soldiers of L Company heard what they thought was outgoing mail and turned out to be the opening of the last act. 6 weeks approximately. The Bulge had been created and had been erased, and the landscape that remained was not the same landscape that had existed before. The villages through which Kampfgruppe Peiper had driven were counting their dead. The field at Bonnier was still under snow. In La Glaise, a king tiger sat in a shed, silent, going nowhere. The human cost of 6 weeks of operations in the northern sector of the Ardennes offensive, the sector we've been examining throughout this documentary, the sector where the 6th SS Panzer Army operated, was, on the American side, somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 killed, wounded, and missing. On the German side, total Ardennes offensive casualties across all formations are estimated at between 67,000 and 100,000, with the imprecision reflecting the state of German records in this period. The 4 SS Panzer divisions of the 6th SS Panzer Army contributed a substantial portion of that total. The 1st SS Panzer Division alone documented 8,262 casualties in 1 month. The Belgian civilian population in the areas Kampfgruppe Peiper operated through, Stavelot, La Glaise, Stoumont, the villages along the Amblève Valley, lost approximately 100 to 130 documented civilian dead from a series of incidents whose full accounting took years of post-war investigation. The Meuse was never crossed. Antwerp was never threatened. Liège was never reached. The King Tiger that sits today outside the December 1944 museum in La Glaise is turret number 213. It weighs 68.65 tons. It sits on a specially reinforced concrete pad designed to support its weight, treated annually against corrosion, its armor plate showing no penetration damage because it was never destroyed by enemy fire. It ran out of fuel on Christmas Eve 1944, was pushed into a shed by its crew, and stayed there for years while the Belgian landscape grew back around it. Children played on it, farmers drove tractors past it. An American attempt to recover it with tow vehicles failed because nothing in the inventory could move a 68-ton machine in soft ground. It is, in a specific and accidental way, the most honest physical monument the Ardennes offensive produced. The most powerful tank Germany ever built, deployed to a campaign it couldn't physically reach, abandoned, not because it was defeated, but because it was empty. Not abgeschlossen. Still not completed. The village of Elsenborn is unremarkable to look at in any season, and particularly in winter, when the ridge above it is open farmland blanketed in the gray-brown quiet of Belgian December. It doesn't announce itself. There's nothing in the landscape that says this is where the 6th SS Panzer Army's last operational chance dissolved, where 348 American guns fired approximately 221,000 rounds over 11 days and broke, systematically, every attack that the 12th SS Panzer Division and its supporting formations threw at them. There's a Belgian military training area on the ridge now. The positions where the artillery was emplaced are somewhere under the farmland, unmarked. The small towns of Krinkelt and Rocherath, where 2 days of street fighting consumed 44 German armored vehicles and held the road open long enough for Robertson's withdrawal to succeed, are quiet and residential. You drive through them in 4 minutes. You couldn't tell from the road what happened there. When I was standing at the Bonnier Memorial on a December morning, I won't specify which visit because the experience is composite and the date doesn't matter. What I kept thinking about was the gap between the physical scale of the place and the historical scale of what happened there. The field is not large. It's a modest pasture and a modest crossroads, the kind of agricultural land that covers most of eastern Belgium. The memorial is simple, names on stone. The names of 84 men who were 22 years old, on average, who had been captured by soldiers of an army that was supposed to follow the same rules they followed, and who were shot in that field and left in the snow. The field is quiet now. It's been quiet for 80 years, in the sense that nothing dramatic has happened on it since December the 17th, 1944. But the names on the stone are still there, and the reading of them still takes 12 minutes, and that duration has not shrunk. The 6th SS Panzer Army's performance in December 1944 and January 1945 produced 3 things, and it's worth being specific about all 3. First, a military failure. The most powerful German formation on the Western Front, given the main effort of Hitler's last strategic gamble, failed to achieve any of its operational objectives, was halted by 2 American infantry divisions at a Belgian ridge, and consumed itself at a rate the German strategic position could not sustain. Second, a moral record. Systematic killing of prisoners of war and civilians across multiple locations over multiple days by multiple units, in a pattern consistent with institutional permission and inconsistent with spontaneous breakdown, for which 73 men were convicted and none served their full sentences. Third, a post-war legacy. 3 decades of organized effort by former members of the formation to establish themselves as soldiers like any others, a campaign that achieved significant legal and political success while leaving the historical record, for those who chose to examine it, substantially unchanged. I came into this project, I should be honest, with a largely formed view. I expected to find what the standard accounts describe, An incompetent political appointee commanding an army built for propaganda rather than warfare, failing predictably against superior Allied logistics and leaving behind a war crimes record that the post-war world handled badly. I did find all of that. But I also found things the standard account doesn't always emphasize. I found the genuine tactical skill of men like Peiper and Dietrich, operating within a system that simultaneously enabled their professionalism and their atrocity. I found the near miss at Stavelo, 3 kilometers, 2.2 million gallons, the decision to halt for the night. That suggests the tactical outcome was less predetermined than the strategic outcome. I found the unresolved logistics document in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv that suggests the fuel crisis was calculated and acknowledged before the offensive began. I found that the argument for explicit atrocity orders, despite being the centerpiece of the prosecution's case in 1946, is probably not the right historical question, and that the more accurate and more troubling explanation involves not a single order, but a culture that didn't need one. None of this complexity is exoneration. The wound patterns at Bonnier don't become less clear because Peiper was tactically gifted. The nicht abgeschlossen entry in Vehicle 213's service log doesn't become less poignant because Dietrich was professionally capable. The 12 minutes it takes to read 84 names at a crossroads in eastern Belgium doesn't shorten because the men who could most directly have prevented those deaths served 6 years and went home to memoirs and pensions and funerals attended by thousands. History doesn't resolve these things. It just insists, when the research is honest enough, that all of them be held in view at once. The last German vehicles crossed back over the Siegfried Line in the final days of January 1945. The snow that had fallen on the Ardennes since mid-December was still deep. In the fields and in the forests and on the frozen Belgian roads, the physical residue of 6 weeks of fighting was everywhere. Burned vehicles, destroyed bridges, the marks of artillery on the farmland, the silence of villages that had been through something most villages don't survive intact. The snow covered most of it. Snow always does, eventually. What it doesn't cover is the names. The 84 names on a stone at Bonnier. The 8,262 on the 1st SS Panzer Division's monthly return. The 5,000 on the 12th SS's Ardennes accounting. The uncountable from both sides who ended in the frozen ground of a campaign that was decided, in the end, at a ridge no one had heard of, by 348 guns and 2 American infantry divisions that refused, against every military expectation, to break. They didn't break. That's the sentence the Ardennes campaign comes down to, when everything else has been examined and the documents have been filed away and the debates have been noted. They didn't break. All the power concentrated in Sepp Dietrich's army, all 500 tanks, all 90 King Tigers, all the political prestige and strategic priority and massed artillery of Hitler's last gamble in the West ran directly into 2 infantry divisions and a ridge and a gun line, and it didn't break them. Everything that followed, Peiper's column, the Malmedy field, the Laglaise barn, the post-war trials, the Cold War commutations, the memoirs and pensions and protests, everything that followed happened because those 2 divisions didn't break, and the armored columns that were built and fueled and crewed to push through them found at the end of their fuel and the end of their reach that they couldn't. The ridge is still there. So are the names.